3 coffins, 3 brothers, 10 seconds that would shatter an empire built on blood. When a nameless gunslinger walked into Dry Hollow and sat at the one table no man dared touch, he didn't just break a rule, he declared war. The Mercer brothers had ruled through terror for 4 brutal years. Their word was law. Their violence was absolute. But Elias Crow wasn't like the others who'd tried and failed. He was something far more dangerous, a man who'd already decided how this story would end. Stay with me until the final shot rings out. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin where fear first learned to die. The sun hadn't fully cleared the eastern ridge when Elias Crow rode into Dry Hollow, but the heat was already building, the kind that makes men mean and decisions fatal. His horse, a gray mare with scars along her flanks that told stories he never would, moved with the steady rhythm of something that had seen too many towns just like this one. Dust hung in the air like judgment deferred. Dry Hollow wasn't much to look at. A main street of weathered wood and broken promises, buildings that leaned into each other like conspirators sharing secrets. The saloon at the north end, the general store, a blacksmith's forge that hadn't been lit in 3 days. The smith had made the mistake of looking at Brock Mercer wrong, and now he was recovering with broken fingers and a lesson learned. The undertaker's parlor sat quiet at the south end, doing steady business. Between them, the town breathed shallow, waiting for the next boot to fall. Elias guided his mare to the hitching post outside Maggie's diner with movements that were neither hurried nor slow. Deliberate, precise, the kind of precision that comes from doing a thing so many times that thought and action become one. He dismounted, tied the reins with a hitch knot that could be released with a single pull, and adjusted his coat. The peacemaker on his hip wasn't for show. Inside the diner, conversation died like a candle snuffed. 6 people had been eating breakfast, scrambled eggs, burnt coffee, biscuits that Maggie made fresh every morning because routine was the only thing that kept her sane in a town gone sick. Now those 6 people weren't eating, they were staring, because the stranger was walking toward that table, the corner booth. Windows on 2 sides, clear sight lines to both the street and the back door. The table the Mercer brothers claimed 4 years ago when they first rode in and decided this town was theirs for the taking. The table where Brock had broken a drifter's arm for not moving fast enough. Where Silas had carved his initials into the wood with a knife still wet with another man's blood. Where Cade had sat with his feet up, cleaning his revolver while the previous sheriff tried to explain why there were laws. That sheriff was dead now, buried in the North Cemetery under a marker that didn't tell the whole truth. Elias sat down. He didn't ask permission, didn't look around for approval. Just pulled out the chair, settled into it like he owned the space, and set his hat on the table. Crown down, the way a man does when he's planning to stay a while. Maggie stood frozen behind the counter, her hand still holding the coffee pot she'd been refilling. She was a woman in her 50s who'd outlived 2 husbands and buried a son. Life had taught her to read danger the way sailors read storms, and this man sitting at the Mercer's table wasn't just dangerous. He was certain. "Coffee," Elias said. His voice was quiet, but it carried. Black, no sugar. "Sir." Maggie's voice cracked slightly. She cleared her throat, tried again. "Sir, you can't sit there." "Already am." "The Mercers can sit somewhere else when they arrive." The other customers were abandoning their meals now, dropping coins on tables, moving toward the door with the careful neutrality of people who'd learned that survival meant not being remembered. A man in coveralls, Pete Harmon, who ran the feed store, paused at the door. His hand was shaking. "Mister, I don't know where you're from, but in Dry Hollow, that table belongs to whoever sits in it." Elias's eyes were gray, the color of gun smoke. They found Pete without malice, without heat, just fact. That's how tables work. Not this one. Not for 4 years. Then it's been wrong for 4 years. Pete left. The door swung shut behind him with a sound like a casket closing. Within minutes, he'd be spreading word. Within the hour, everyone would know. By noon, the Mercers would hear. That was the point. Maggie approached with the coffee pot. her survival instinct warring with her conscience. The conscience won. It usually did with Maggie, which was why she'd kept the diner open when smarter people had sold and left. She poured the coffee, and her hand only shook a little. "You got a name?" she asked quietly. "Elias Crow." "That's supposed to mean something?" "Not yet." She studied his face, hard lines and old scars, a jawline that had taken punches and a nose that had been broken at least twice. But it was his eyes that told the real story. They'd seen things, done things, carried things that most men spent their whole lives running from. "Mr. Crow, those 3 men you're provoking, they're not like regular trouble. Brock's mean, Silas is smart, and Cade..." She paused. "Cade's fast. Faster than anyone I've ever seen draw." "Good to know." "That's it? Good to know?" Elias took a sip of his coffee. It was terrible, burnt and bitter. He drank it anyway. How long since someone stood up to them? Maggie's face went tight. 4 years, 2 months. Man named Thomas Whelan. He was a deputy from Colorado passing through. Saw Brock beating a Chinese laundry worker in the street. Told him to stop. She set the coffee pot down. They found Thomas 3 days later in the canyon. Animals had gotten to him, but we could still see the bullet holes. "And the sheriff?" "Sheriff Dawes?" Maggie laughed, but there was no humor in it. "He wears the badge and signs the papers the Mercers tell him to sign. Drinks himself quiet every night at the saloon. He's alive because he stopped being a lawman the day Thomas died." "Where's his office?" 2 buildings down, but he won't help you." "Not asking for help." Elias finished his coffee. "Just want to know where to find him when this is done." The door opened. The temperature in the diner dropped 10 degrees despite the morning heat. A kid, couldn't be more than 17, stood in the doorway breathing hard like he'd been running. His name was Charlie, and he worked at the livery stable mucking stalls because his father had died owing the Mercers money, and debt in Dry Hollow was inherited. "Maggie," Charlie's voice was high, afraid. "Maggie, the Mercers are coming. Someone told them about..." His eyes found Elias. "Oh, hell. Oh, hell, mister. You gotta go. You gotta go right now." "Charlie, get out of here," Maggie said sharply. "But now." The kid fled. The door swung shut again. Maggie turned to Elias, and for a moment, he saw something in her face that looked almost like hope. It was a dangerous thing to see. Hope. It made people believe. And belief in a place like Dry Hollow could get you killed. "Whatever you're planning," she said, "it won't work. They've got men. 6, maybe 7, who do their bidding. And the 3 of them..." She shook her head. "I've seen Brock beat a man to death with his bare hands. I've seen Silas talk a widow into signing over her property and then burn it down with her still inside. And Cade once shot a man for walking too close to his horse. They're not just killers, Mr. Crow. They're a sickness, and this town's been dying from it for 4 years." Elias stood. He placed 2 coins on the table, one for the coffee, one for Maggie's honesty. "Then it's time for a cure. You can't cure this alone." "Won't be alone." He picked up his hat, settled it on his head. "I'll have gravity on my side. Bullets fall the same for everyone." He walked out before she could respond. No, the street had emptied. Shutters were closing, doors locking. The few people still visible were moving with purpose toward anywhere but here. Dry Hollow was a town that had learned to recognize the moments before violence the way animals sense earthquakes. Elias stood on the diner's porch and let his eyes map the territory. The main street ran straight, maybe 200 yards from the saloon to the undertaker's. Wood buildings on both sides, most 2 stories. Alleys between them, some wide enough for a horse, others barely wide enough for a man to slip through sideways. Second-floor windows that could hide a rifle. Rooftops with sight lines. The church steeple at the east end empty since the preacher had spoken out against the Mercers and been found hanging from his own bell rope. Ruled a suicide by Sheriff Dawes. Every angle of fire. Every position of advantage. He cataloged it all in seconds. 3 riders were coming from the north. He could hear the hoofbeats now, steady and unhurried. They knew no one was going anywhere. Why rush? Elias stepped off the porch and walked south, toward the undertaker's parlor. Behind curtains, people watched. In the general store, the owner, a man named Saul who'd once been friends with Thomas Whelan, stood with his hand on a shotgun he'd never have the courage to use. In the boarding house, a woman named Beth Carver held her daughter close, and whispered prayers she didn't believe anymore. In the saloon, the bartender polished glasses that were already clean and tried not to think about whose blood he'd be mopping up before sundown. The undertaker's parlor was cool and dark. The smell of wood varnish and formaldehyde hung heavy. A man in his 60s looked up from a half-finished casket, saw Elias, and set down his plane with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned not to make sudden movements. "Help you?" His voice was cautious. "Need 3 coffins." The undertaker, his name was Morris, blinked. 3? By 4 o'clock this afternoon. That's only 7 hours. Then you'd best get started. Morris studied Elias the way he studied bodies, looking for the story beneath the surface. He'd been burying people in Dry Hollow for 30 years. He'd buried good people and bad. He'd buried the hopeful and the broken. He'd buried Sheriff Whelan's predecessor and Sheriff Whelan himself and the dozen others who'd stood up and been put down. "The Mercers," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. 3 coffins, 4 o'clock. Can you do it? Morris looked at his hands. They were steady, which surprised him. "Plain boxes or proper coffins?" "Your choice. They won't care either way." "Will you need 3? It was the real question, the one that mattered. Because if this stranger needed 3 coffins and came up short, Morris would be measuring him for a 4th. Elias met his eyes. "Yes." Something in that single word, the certainty, the absolute lack of doubt, made Morris believe him. He nodded slowly. "Pine boxes. I can have them ready. But Mr. He hesitated. "Brock Mercers killed 11 men. Silas has killed 7. Cade's killed 13 that we know of. And that's not counting the ones they had their hired guns do. 31. Elias said it like he was confirming a grocery order. "You don't seem worried. Being worried won't change what needs doing." Morris picked up his plane again. 4 o'clock. They'll be ready." Elias turned to leave, then paused. "The people they killed? They buried here?" "Most. North Cemetery for the respectable ones. East Plot for the others." "Thomas Whelan?" Morris's jaw tightened. "North Cemetery, next to his wife. She died of heartbreak 6 months after they killed him. Doctor called it a stroke, but we all knew. I'll need to know where Sheriff Dawes lives. Above the saddle shop, but like Maggie probably told you, he won't, not asking him to help, just want to know where to find him when the law needs to come back to work." Morris almost smiled. "Almost. You really think you can do this?" "Thinking's already done. Now it's just time." Outside, the Mercer brothers had arrived. Brock Mercer was the eldest at 42, and he wore his cruelty like a badge of honor. 6'3", 240 pounds of muscle and meanness. His knuckles were scarred from beating men with his fists when bullets seemed too quick. He had a face that looked like it had been carved from granite by someone who'd run out of patience halfway through. Hard angles, a nose that had been broken and set wrong, eyes the color of dirty ice. He sat his horse in the middle of the street like a general surveying conquered territory. Because that's what it was. Conquered. Silas Mercer was 38 and looked like a banker who'd gone to the devil for a loan and liked the terms. Slimmer than Brock, better dressed, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that calculated odds the way some men calculated cards. He was the brains, the one who turned violence into profit, who knew which properties to seize and which officials to buy. He'd killed fewer men than his brothers, but the deaths he orchestrated were colder, more efficient. Silas didn't kill in rage. He killed in spreadsheets. Cade Mercer was the youngest at 34, and he was the one people feared most. Not because he was stronger than Brock or smarter than Silas, but because he was fast. Lightning made flesh. His right hand hung loose by his revolver, a Colt single-action army with a walnut grip worn smooth from use. People said he could draw and fire in under a second. People said he'd once killed 2 men in a duel and had his gun back in its holster before the second body hit the ground. People said a lot of things about Cade Mercer, and most of them were true. 6 men rode with them. Hired guns, each one wanted somewhere, each one paid in stolen money to do the Mercers' killing when the brothers didn't feel like getting their own hands dirty. They fanned out now, taking positions along the street with the practiced ease of men who'd done this before. Brock dismounted. His boots hit the dirt with the weight of judgment. Where is he? The question was directed at no one and everyone. The town held its collective breath. Maggie appeared in the diner doorway, her spine straight despite the fear in her eyes. He went to Morris's place. The Undertaker? Silas's voice was smooth, cultured. He could have been asking about the weather. How delightfully unsubtle. Cade laughed. It was a sound without warmth. 3 coffins, I heard. That right, Maggie? That's what he said. Optimistic. Cade stroked his revolver's grip almost lovingly. Most men overestimate and bring 4. Brock started walking toward the Undertaker's parlor. His brothers fell in beside him, flanking him like wolves. The 6 hired guns spread out, creating a net. This was choreography they'd performed before. Surround, intimidate, kill if necessary, disappear the bodies if required. The system had worked for 4 years. Elias was waiting in the street when they arrived. He stood 40 feet from the Undertaker's porch, positioned so the afternoon sun would be at his back in a few hours. His coat was unbuttoned. His hand hung loose at his side, not touching his gun, but not far from it either. He'd removed his gloves. Shooting with gloves was possible, but imprecise, and precision was about to matter more than anything else in the world. Brock stopped 20 feet away. His brothers stopped with him. The hired guns formed a semicircle, cutting off retreat. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The wind pushed dust down the empty street. Somewhere a shutter banged. A horse whinnied nervously. You sat at my table, Brock said finally. It's a table. Elias's voice was calm. Not a throne. In my town, it amounts to the same thing. Your town? Elias let his eyes drift over the shuttered buildings, the hiding faces. Looks more like a graveyard with some houses in it. Silas chuckled. He's articulate. I appreciate that. So few of the men who challenge us have any poetry to them. They just bluster and die. You kill them all? Elias asked. The stupid ones and the brave ones? Silas adjusted his coat. Sometimes they're the same person. Which are you? Neither. I'm just the one who's here. Cade stepped forward. He moved like a dancer, balanced, ready. You ordered 3 coffins. I did. For us? For whoever needs them by sundown. Could be you. Could be, Elias agreed. But it won't be. Brock's face darkened. People didn't talk to him like this. People didn't stand in his street and challenge him with words that felt like punches. His hand flexed, wanting to reach for his gun, but Silas put a hand on his arm. Wait, Silas said softly. Then louder, to Elias. You have a name, stranger? Elias Crow. Should that mean something to us? Not yet. You're confident. I respect that. But confidence without competence is just noise. Silas's smile was a snake's smile. So let me explain how this works. You apologize for the disrespect. You get on your horse. You ride out before my brother loses his temper and breaks you into pieces. And we forget this ever happened. No. No? I'm staying. You're leaving. Those are the options. Cade laughed again. You and what army? Elias's eyes, those gray, smoke-colored eyes, found Cade's. Don't need an army. Just need to be faster than you. The street went so quiet you could hear hearts beating. Cade's smile vanished. His hand moved fractionally closer to his gun. Say that again. You heard me the first time. Mister, I've killed 13 men. Every single one of them thought they were faster. 14 men, Elias corrected. You're forgetting the kid in El Paso. The one who was drunk and could barely stand. You shot him in the back and counted it. The color drained from Cade's face. That information, that specific, impossible-to-know information, hung in the air like an accusation. Because Elias was right. There had been a kid in El Paso, 3 years ago, drunk, stumbling, wearing a gun he didn't know how to use. Cade had put a bullet in his spine and laughed about it. No one outside the brothers knew about that. Who are you? Brock's voice was low, dangerous. Told you already? Elias Crow. Where you from? Lots of places. Why are you here? Because this town needs fixing, and you 3 are what's broken. Silas's calculating eyes narrowed. You're a lawman. That's what this is. Federal Marshal? Pinkerton? Neither. Just a man who sees what's wrong. And fixes it? Silas's voice dripped skepticism. You're going to fix us? 3 men and 6 guns by yourself? 3 coffins, Elias said. 4 o'clock. That's when you'll know for sure. Brock had heard enough. He took a step forward, his massive frame radiating violence. I'm going to enjoy beating you to death, Crow. I'm going to break every bone in your body. I'm going to... 4 o'clock, Elias repeated. He didn't step back, didn't flinch. You'll be there or you won't. Either way, this ends today. He turned and walked away. The sheer audacity of it, the absolute disrespect of turning your back on the Mercer brothers, left them stunned for 3 full seconds. Brock's hand went to his gun, but Silas grabbed his wrist. Not here, Silas hissed. Not like this. He turned his back on us. Because he wants you angry. Angry men make mistakes. Silas watched Elias disappear around a corner. We do this right. 4 o'clock, like he said. We bring everyone. We make it public. And we make it slow. I want him broken, Brock snarled. You'll get it, but we do it smart. Silas turned to the hired guns. Spread out. Watch him. I want to know everywhere he goes, everyone he talks to. And at 4 o'clock, his smile returned. At 4 o'clock, we give this town a reminder of why they fear us. The brothers remounted. They rode north, back toward their compound, a ranch house on the edge of town that they'd seized from a family who'd made the mistake of defaulting on a loan. The hired guns dispersed into the town's shadows. Behind curtains, people exhaled, but they didn't relax, because everyone knew what 4 o'clock would bring, and no one thought Elias Crow would survive it. The sheriff's office was exactly what Elias expected. Dusty, disorganized, smelling of whiskey and resignation. Sheriff Marcus Dawes sat behind a desk covered in unfiled papers, a bottle of rotgut within easy reach. He was 56 years old and looked 70. The badge on his chest was tarnished. When Elias walked in, Dawes didn't even look up. Whatever you want, I can't help you. I know. That made Dawes look up. Elias stood in the doorway, backlit by the noon sun. Then why are you here? Wanted to see what a dead man looks like before he's buried. Dawes's hand trembled toward the bottle. He poured himself 2 fingers, drank it in one swallow. You the one who sat at their table? I am. And ordered 3 coffins. That too. Then you're the dead man, not me. Elias entered the office, closed the door behind him. You were a lawman once, real one, Texas Rangers before this. Dawes's eyes widened slightly. How'd you... The way you wear your gun. The calluses on your trigger hand. The Ranger star on the bottom of that bottle. You turned it upside down so you wouldn't have to look at it, but it's there. Elias pulled out a chair, sat without invitation. You were good at it too. 15 years of service, 12 commendations, 2 letters of thanks from the governor. That was a long time ago. 4 years, that's how long ago. Dawes poured another drink. Didn't drink it yet, just stared at it. Thomas Whelan was my friend, best friend I ever had. When they killed him, He trailed off. I made a choice. Live quiet or die loud. I chose living. And you've been dying quiet ever since. The words hit like a fist. Dawes's hand clenched around the glass. You don't know anything about it. You don't know what it's like to watch good people suffer and not be able to... I know exactly what it's like. Elias's voice was quiet but cut through Dawes's protest. I know what it's like to stand by while wrong wins. I know what it's like to tell yourself tomorrow will be different, and I know what it's like to wake up one day and realize tomorrow never comes unless you make it. So what, you're here to make tomorrow? Dawes laughed bitterly. You're here to be the hero? I'm here to remove an infection. What happens after is up to the people who survive it. They'll kill you. Maybe. Probably. Possibly, Elias corrected. But someone has to be first. Someone has to show this town that fear isn't permanent. Dawes stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he pushed the bottle away. What do you want from me? When it's over, if it goes the way I think it will, this town's going to need a sheriff. Real one, the kind you used to be. I'm not that man anymore. Then find him again. He's not as dead as you think. Elias stood, moved to the door. He paused with his hand on the knob. Thomas Whelan died trying to do the right thing. Don't make his death meaningless by never trying again. The next stop was the freight office. Mara Dyer was 31 years old, 5'6", with shoulders hardened by loading wagons and eyes hardened by loss. Her father had owned Dyer Freight until the Mercers decided they wanted it. When he refused to sell, they burned 2 of his wagons and broke his back. He died 3 months later, never walking again. Mara inherited what was left: 2 wagons, a warehouse, and a lifetime of debt to men who smiled while they extorted her. She was in the warehouse checking inventory when Elias appeared. She spun, hand going to the knife on her belt, a reflex born from too many times Brock had cornered her in here, made his offers, made his threats. "Easy," Elias said, hands visible. "Not here to cause trouble." "Then you're the only man in this town who isn't." Her voice was hard. "You're the one. The table. The coffins." "That's me." "You're either the bravest man I've ever met or the stupidest. Probably both." He looked around the warehouse. Half-empty shelves, wagon parts that should have been replaced months ago. The economics of survival under occupation. "How much do you owe them?" "What's it to you?" "Wondering what happens to you when they're gone," Mara laughed, sharp and bitter. "When they're gone?" "Mister, they're not going anywhere except to watch you die at 4 o'clock. That happens. You'll keep owing them. That doesn't happen." He met her eyes. "You get a chance to rebuild. Start clean. You really think you can beat them?" "I think I can remove the problem. What you do with the solution is up to you." She studied him. This strange, certain man who talked about killing the Mercers the way other men talked about shoeing horses. "Brock's been after this place for 2 years. Wants to control all freight in and out of town. Last month he made me an offer. Marry him, and the debt disappears." "What'd you say?" "I told him I'd rather burn this place to the ground myself." She smiled without humor. "He said he'd arrange that if I didn't change my mind by month's end. That's 6 days from now." "Won't need 6 days. You sound awfully sure." "I've done this before." "Done what? Walked into a town and challenged 3 killers?" "Fixed what's broken." Elias turned to leave, then paused. "After 4 o'clock, you might want to be somewhere with a clear view of the street. What happens next is going to decide what kind of town this becomes." The afternoon aged toward destiny. Elias walked the town's perimeter, noting every angle, every alley, every position of advantage. The church steeple would give a rifleman clear shots in 3 directions. The rooftop of the saloon covered the north end. The general store's 2nd floor commanded the center. He noted which doors opened inward, which opened out. Which windows were real glass, which were just shutters. Where the sun would be at 4 o'clock and how shadows would fall. The hired guns watching him saw a man taking a walk. They didn't see what he was actually doing, learning a battlefield. At 3:30, he returned to Morris's undertaker parlor. The 3 coffins were ready. Simple pine boxes, rough but sturdy. They sat in a row like pupils waiting for a lesson. Morris stood beside them, wiping his hands on a rag. "They're done," he said simply. "Good work." "You still think you'll need all 3? Elias ran his hand along the nearest coffin's edge. The wood was smooth, properly joined. Morris had done this right, not because he believed Elias would succeed, but because doing things right was all that separated him from the chaos outside. "Yes," Elias said. "The whole town's talking. Some people are betting you'll run. Most are betting you'll die." "Anyone betting I'll win?" Morris hesitated, then, "Me. I put $2 on you with Saul at the general store, 20 to 1 odds. That's faith. That's $40 if you live." Morris tried to smile. Failed. "I figure if you die, I won't need the money anyway. The Mercers will burn this place down for helping you." "They won't get the chance." Elias checked his peacemaker. Cylinder full, 6 rounds. He'd loaded them this morning with the same care a priest prepares communion, each bullet a prayer in metal and powder. The gun was clean, well-oiled. He'd carried it for 8 years, and it had never failed him. Today wouldn't be the first time. "Mr. Crow," Morris said quietly, "why are you doing this? This isn't your town. These aren't your people." "No," Elias agreed, "but wrong is wrong, whether it's in my town or yours, and someone has to stand up. If not me, who? If not now, when?" Thomas Whelan stood up. "And because of that, I will too. Men like him make it possible for men like me." The church bell tolled 4 times. The sound rolled across Dry Hollow like a death knell. Elias settled his hat on his head, adjusted his coat one last time. "Keep those coffins ready, Morris. We'll know who needs them soon enough." He walked out into the street. The sun was a brass coin in the western sky, throwing long shadows eastward. The main street was empty except for one man standing alone in the dust. From the north, riding in formation, came the Mercer brothers and their 6 hired guns. Behind every window, every crack, and every shutter, the town of Dry Hollow held its breath and watched the storm arrive. This was how empires ended, not with grand armies or noble speeches, but with one man standing in a dusty street, deciding that today was the day fear would learn to die. The Mercers stopped 50 feet away and dismounted. Elias stood his ground, hand loose at his side, eyes measuring distances and calculating odds that would be settled in heartbeats. "Last chance, Crow," Brock called. "Walk away. Live another day." 3 coffins, Elias replied. "By 4 o'clock. I'm a man of my word." Silas laughed. "So are we. And we gave this town our word that no one challenges us and lives." "Then someone's about to break their word." Cade stepped forward, his hand hovering near his revolver. "I'm going to enjoy this. Been a long time since someone was stupid enough to test me." "Not stupid," Elias said quietly. "Just necessary." The wind died. The street fell into a silence so complete that you could hear leather creaking, spurs jingling, breath rasping in nervous throats. In the diner, Maggie pressed her face to the window, tears already forming. In the warehouse, Mara Dyer gripped her knife and prayed to a deity she'd stopped believing in. In the sheriff's office, Marcus Dawes stared at his badge and remembered who he used to be. In the undertaker's parlor, Morris touched the 3 coffins and wondered whose names would be carved on them by nightfall. And in the street, Elias Crow stood alone against 9 men and smiled. Not because he was happy, not because he was confident, but because he'd done this before, and he knew what they didn't. The fastest draw doesn't matter. What matters is shooting first. "Well?" Brock demanded. "You called this dance. Let's see if you can finish it." Elias's hand moved, not toward his gun, toward his pocket. He pulled out a silver pocket watch, flipped it open, and checked the time with deliberate, insulting slowness. 4 o'clock exactly, he said. Right on time. Then he snapped the watch shut, and everything changed. The pocket watch disappeared back into Elias's coat, and with it went the last second of peace Dry Hollow would know that day. But the gunfire everyone expected didn't come. Instead, Elias turned away from the 9 men facing him and walked, not ran, walked toward the general store. His back was to them again, that same calculated insult that had stunned them earlier. Brock's face went purple with rage. "You son of a—" Brock's hand went to his gun. "Wait." Silas's voice cut through his brother's fury like a blade through silk. "Look at him. Really look." They watched as Elias reached the store's porch, climbed the 3 steps with unhurried precision, and disappeared inside. Through the window, they could see him talking to Saul, the store owner, gesturing, pointing at something on a shelf. "He's shopping," Cade said, disbelief dripping from every syllable. "That crazy bastard is shopping." "He's stalling," one of the hired guns muttered, trying to figure a way out. But Silas knew better. His mind worked through angles the way a chess player works through moves, and nothing about this added up. A man didn't order 3 coffins, insult the Mercer brothers twice, and then go buy supplies unless he had a plan. The question was, what plan could possibly work against 9 guns? "Spread out," Silas ordered quietly. "Jackson, Miller, take the rooftops. Carson, watch the back door. Whoever this crow is, he doesn't leave this street alive." The hired guns moved into position with practiced efficiency. Jackson and Miller headed for the buildings flanking the general store, looking for access to the roofs. Carson circled around back. The remaining 3, Reed, Torres, and a scarred man everyone called Knuckles, positioned themselves to create a crossfire. Brock dismounted, his massive hands flexing. "I want him alive first, just alive enough to feel what I do to him." "We'll see," Silas said, "but don't underestimate him. Any man who walks into this situation either has a death wish or an ace we haven't seen yet." Inside the general store, Saul stood behind his counter with sweat beading on his forehead. His shotgun was underneath, loaded, but his hands were nowhere near it. Elias was examining a box of ammunition with the casual interest of a man picking out vegetables. "Mr. Crow." Saul's voice was barely a whisper. "They're surrounding the building. I need 45 rounds, same caliber as this." Elias set a bullet from his peacemaker on the counter. 45 long Colt. "You have them?" Yes, but..." "And a length of rope. 30 feet should do it. Strong hemp, not that sea salt garbage that frays." Saul stared at him. Outside, 9 armed men were preparing to turn him into a corpse, and this stranger was concerned about rope quality. "Are you insane?" "Prepared." Elias's gray eyes found Saul's. "The back door. It opens onto the alley between here and the feed store, correct?" "Yes." "Width of that alley?" "Maybe 6 feet? 7 at the widest?" "Good. And the feed store's back door, it locked?" "During the day, yeah. Pete Harmon locks it when he's working the front." Elias nodded, processing. "The rope and ammunition. Now, please." Saul moved mechanically, grabbing the items. His hands shook as he wrapped the rope. "They're going to kill you. You know that, right? Even if you get past the ones in the street, the ones on the rooftops will..." "How much do I owe you?" "What?" "For the rope and ammunition. How much?" Saul laughed, a sound on the edge of hysteria. "You're about to die and you're worried about paying." "I'm worried about doing things right." Elias counted out coins, exact change, and placed them on the counter. "A man pays his debts. Otherwise, he's no different from the ones outside who take what they want." The simple dignity of it, the absolute refusal to let chaos change who he was, made Saul's throat tighten. He'd spent 4 years watching good people compromise piece by piece until there was nothing left but survival. And here was a stranger who wouldn't even steal rope while facing death. "The shotgun under your counter," Elias said casually. "It loaded?" Saul froze. "How did you..." "You keep glancing down at it. Natural reflex when you're scared and armed." Elias pocketed the ammunition, coiled the rope over his shoulder. "When the shooting starts, stay down. Don't try to help. Don't try to run. Just stay down until it's over." "Which way will it go?" "Can't say for certain, but those coffins are getting filled today, one way or another." Elias moved toward the back of the store. Saul watched him go. This strange man who talked about violence like a craftsman discussing his work. No passion, no fear, just the calm certainty of someone who'd done a job many times before. "Mr. Crow," Saul called out. When Elias turned back, Saul was holding the shotgun now, no longer hiding it. "If you do survive this, the town's going to need people like you." "Town's got people like me already. They're just scared to remember it." Elias nodded toward the street. "Give them a reason to remember, and they'll be fine." He slipped through the back door into the alley. Carson was waiting there, revolver already drawn. He was a wiry man with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw, a souvenir from a knife fight in Abilene. He'd killed 6 men in his 32 years, and every one of them had underestimated how fast he could shoot. "End of the line, friend," Carson said, his gun trained on Elias's chest. "Boss wants you alive, but I don't get paid extra for following preferences." Elias stood very still, hands visible, rope coiled over one shoulder. "You're Carson. Used to ride with the Taggart gang out of Kansas." Carson's eyes narrowed. "How'd you know that?" "Heard about you. Heard you were good with a gun, but better at staying alive. Smart enough to know when the odds aren't worth the payout." "These odds look just fine to me. One gun beats no guns." "Who said I have no guns?" Elias's coat was still buttoned, his peacemaker hidden. But something in his voice made Carson's finger tighten on the trigger. "Don't even think about..." The rope uncoiled like a striking snake. Elias's hand had been on it the whole time, and he'd been measuring the distance with his eyes. 7 feet, easy range. The hemp loop caught Carson's gun hand at the wrist, and Elias yanked hard. Carson's revolver discharged, the bullet going wide, punching through a fence board. Before he could recover, Elias was inside his reach. An elbow to the temple, fast and brutal. Carson dropped like a puppet with cut strings. The gunshot echoed through the alley. Shouts erupted from the street. Elias grabbed Carson's revolver, checked the cylinder, 5 rounds left, and shoved it into his belt. He dragged the unconscious man into the shadows behind a stack of crates, then moved deeper into the alley maze. The backways of Dry Hollow formed a network that most people never thought about. Narrow passages between buildings, connecting alleys, spaces where the town's infrastructure lived hidden from the main street. Elias had studied them during his walk earlier, mapping routes and exits. Now he used that knowledge. He emerged 2 buildings down, near the blacksmith shop. The forge was cold, had been for days since Brock broke the smith's fingers, but the building provided cover. Through the gaps in the wall boards, Elias could see the street. Jackson had made it to the roof of the building across from the general store. He was crouched behind a false front, rifle in hand, scanning for targets. Miller was still climbing to his position. The remaining men were focused on the general store's front entrance, expecting Elias to either come out fighting or surrender. They were learning the wrong lesson. Elias circled wide, using buildings as cover, moving through the spaces between the town's facades. He passed the dress shop where a woman named Claire had once sewn wedding gowns until the Mercers taxed her out of business. Past the old land office where deeds had been forged and families dispossessed. Every building held a story of what this town had been and what it had become. He was rewriting that story, one calculated move at a time. The feed store's back door was locked, just as Saul had said. Elias examined the lock, simple mechanism, probably older than he was. He could pick it, but that would take time he didn't have. Instead, he moved to the window beside it. Inside, Pete Harmon was crouched behind a counter, clearly having heard the gunshot. His eyes went wide when he saw Elias at the window. Elias made a gesture. Unlock the door. Pete shook his head frantically, pointing toward the street where the Mercers waited. Elias tried the window. Locked. He looked at Pete again, and this time his eyes held something that wasn't quite a threat, but wasn't quite a request either. It was an inevitability. That door was opening. The question was whether Pete opened it or Elias broke through. Pete must have seen something in that look. Maybe recognized the same certainty that had sent him running from the diner that morning. He crawled to the back door and turned the key with shaking hands. Elias slipped inside, closed the door silently behind him. "They're going to kill me for this," Pete whispered. "When they find out I helped you, they won't find out, and even if they do, they won't be in a position to do anything about it. You can't beat 9 men. Don't need to beat 9, just need to change the math." Elias moved to the front of the store, staying low, using the shelves as cover. Through the window, he could see Brock and Silas still in the street, focused on the general store. Cade had moved closer, his hand on his gun, ready. "What are you going to do?" Pete asked. "What needs doing?" Elias studied the angles. From here, he had a clear line to the street, but no good exit if things went wrong. The feed store's front door opened directly onto the main street. Step out there, and he'd be in a crossfire between the men on the ground and Jackson on the roof. So he didn't plan to use the door. "This building," Elias said quietly. "It shares a wall with the saddle shop, right?" "Yeah, but..." "And the saddle shop connects to the barber shop through a back storage area." Pete blinked. "How did you know that?" "I pay attention." Elias had seen it during his earlier reconnaissance. Noticed how the buildings leaned together, how certain doors opened onto shared spaces, how this town had grown organically over decades, creating connections its current residents had forgotten. "You can't go through there. The barber shop's locked, and even if it wasn't, it opens right onto the street near where Cade's standing." "I know." Elias was already moving toward the shared wall. "Where's the connecting door?" "Back corner, behind the grain sacks, but it's..." Elias found it. The door was old, painted over multiple times, easy to miss if you weren't looking. He tested the handle. Locked, but the wood around the latch was soft with age and neglect. One solid kick would do it, but a kick would make noise, and noise would give away his position. Instead, he used the knife from his boot, a thin blade meant for precision work, and worried at the latch mechanism. The screws were rusty, the wood warped. With patient pressure, he worked the entire latch plate free from the frame. The door swung open silently. "How did you..." Pete trailed off, watching this stranger dismantle locks with the same calm efficiency he'd shown ordering coffee. "Practice." Elias stepped through into the saddle shop's storage area. It smelled of leather and oil, shelves lined with bridles and saddle parts. "Stay down, Pete. When you hear shooting, get on the floor and stay there. Understood?" Pete nodded mutely. The saddle shop was dim, lit only by light filtering through cracks in the walls. Elias moved through it like a ghost, his boots making no sound on the wooden floor. He'd removed his spurs earlier, another detail most men would miss, but spurs jingle, and jingles get you killed. Sheriff Dawes lived above this shop, in rooms accessed by an external staircase. But there was also an internal ladder meant for the shop owner to check on things. Elias found it in the corner. He climbed. The upper floor was a single room divided by curtains into sleeping area, small kitchen, and sitting space. Dawes wasn't there, probably still in his office, drinking his courage away or watching from his window as events unfolded. But what Elias wanted wasn't Dawes. It was the window. This window faced the street at an angle, positioned perfectly to see both the ground positions and the rooftop where Jackson waited with his rifle. More importantly, it was a window no one would expect to be a threat. Elias eased it open, just an inch. The hinges creaked slightly, but the sound was lost beneath the tension in the street below. Silas was talking now, his voice carrying in the stillness. "Mr. Crow, we know you're in one of these buildings. You can't hide forever. Why don't you come out, and we'll discuss this like reasonable men?" Reasonable men. The phrase would have been funny if it wasn't so obscene. These were men who'd built an empire on broken bones and stolen lives, offering reasonable discussion, like a hangman offering a choice of ropes. Elias pulled Carson's revolver from his belt, the one he'd taken in the alley, 5 shots. He checked his own peacemaker, 6 shots, 11 bullets total against 9 men, assuming he'd counted the hired guns correctly. Not great odds, but he'd worked with worse. The real weapon wasn't bullets, though. It was understanding. Elias had learned long ago that gunfights weren't won by the fastest draw or the best aim. They were won by the person who controlled the terrain, the timing, and most importantly, the psychology. Right now, the Mercers thought they had him cornered. They thought he was scared, hiding, maybe trying to find a way to surrender with his pride intact. They were wrong on every count, and that wrongness was going to cost them everything. Elias aimed Carson's revolver at Jackson's position on the rooftop across the street. The angle was tricky, maybe 60 feet, elevated, with crosswind, but Jackson was exposed, focused on watching the general store's entrance, not expecting fire from a window that had been empty all day. The first shot would give away Elias's position. That meant it had to count, and it had to be followed immediately by movement. Shoot and stay still, you die. Shoot and move, you survive. He breathed slowly, letting his heart rate settle. Through the window, he could hear Cade laughing at something Brock had said, could hear horses shifting nervously, sensing the violence building in the air like static before a lightning strike. "Last chance, Crow," Brock bellowed. "Come out now or we burn every building until we find you." Elias squeezed the trigger. The revolver bucked. The bullet crossed 60 feet in a fraction of a heartbeat and caught Jackson in the shoulder, spinning him. The rifle fell from his hands, clattering down the roof slope and dropping into the street with a clatter that sounded like a bell tolling. The street exploded into chaos. "Rooftop, he's in the—" someone shouted, but Elias was already moving. He dropped the revolver, rolled away from the window, and headed for the ladder. Bullets punched through the walls where he'd been standing, splinters exploding inward. He didn't go down the ladder. Instead, he kicked open a small access panel in the floor, the kind used for maintenance, and dropped through into the saddle shop below. His landing was hard but controlled, knees bent to absorb impact. More gunfire above, destroying the empty room he'd just left. Elias moved back through the storage area, retracing his path. Behind him, he could hear boots pounding on the external stairs, someone rushing up to check the room. Good. Let them waste time on ghosts. He emerged back into the feed store. Pete was on the floor, hands over his head, exactly where he should be. Elias gave him a nod, stay down, and continued through to the building's far side. There was a window here that faced north toward the edge of town. Elias opened it and looked out. 20 feet to the ground, maybe. Acceptable drop if you knew how to land. But he didn't drop. Not yet. Instead, he took the coiled rope still slung over his shoulder and secured one end to the heavy counter bolted to the floor. He tossed the rest out the window, letting it dangle. Then he fired 2 shots from his peacemaker out the window. Not at targets, just into the air. Shouts erupted, footsteps running, men repositioning, thinking he was escaping out the north side. Elias went out the back door. The alley was empty. Carson was still unconscious behind the crates. Elias moved east, away from the sounds of pursuit, putting buildings between himself and the hunters. He counted in his head. Jackson was wounded, probably out of the fight. Carson was down. That left 7. The math was getting better. He circled around, using the alleys like hallways in a house, only he had the map to. The Mercers and their men were reacting now, not planning. Reaction meant mistakes. Mistakes meant opportunities. Elias emerged near the church, the one with the empty steeple where the preacher had died for speaking truth. The building's side door was unlocked. Places of worship rarely locked their doors in frontier towns, even ones that had forgotten how to pray. Inside, the church was cool and dim. Dust motes floated in shafts of light from high windows. The pews were empty, the pulpit silent. This had been a place of hope once. Now, it was just a shell. Another thing the Mercers had broken without burning. Elias climbed the stairs to the steeple. The view from the top was perfect. He could see the entire main street laid out below like a tactical map. Could see Miller on the opposite rooftop, rifle trained on the feed store's north window where the rope dangled. Could see Torres and Reed in the street, guns drawn, covering angles. Could see Brock and Silas near their horses, Silas talking urgently while Brock's face was twisted with rage. Could see Cade standing alone in the center of the street, turning slowly, scanning for threats, his hand never far from his gun. 4 shots fired. 7 rounds left in the Peacemaker. 7 men still standing. The math was getting very tight. Elias studied the positions, calculating. Miller was the next priority. Another rifle meant another angle of fire, another position that could pin him down. But Miller had learned from Jackson's mistake. He was behind cover, only exposing himself for quick glances, never staying still long enough to be a clean target. Smart. That meant Miller would have to wait. Torres and Reed were moving together, sweeping toward the church. They'd figured out the pattern. Elias was using buildings, staying mobile, attacking from unexpected angles. Now they were checking every structure, clearing them one by one. They'd reached the church in maybe 2 minutes. Elias descended the stairwell quickly, quietly. At the bottom, he moved to the church's front entrance and eased the door open just a crack. Torres and Reed were 40 feet away, approaching with weapons ready, covering each other the way trained men do. "Church is next," Torres was saying. "If he's in there—" "He's running," Reed interrupted. "All this hit-and-move bullshit. He knows he can't stand and fight." "Maybe. Or maybe he's thinning us out before the real fight starts." Reed spat into the dust. "There's 7 of us left and 1 of him. He's out of road." They were at the church steps now. Elias let them come, counting their footfalls. 1 step, 2, 3. He kicked the door open and shot Torres through the chest before the man could raise his gun. The bullet took him high, between the collarbones, and Torres went down without a sound. Reed fired back, fast, his bullet taking a chunk out of the doorframe near Elias's head. But Elias had already rolled left, putting the thick wooden frame between them. Reed's second shot went wide. Elias waited. Heard Reed's breathing, harsh and quick, heard the click of a hammer being cocked, then heard the sound he'd been waiting for, footsteps retreating. Reed was backing up, getting distance, trying to reposition for a better angle. Elias went out the side door and came around the church's corner at a run. Reed saw him too late, was turning, bringing his gun up. Elias fired twice. Both bullets found their mark. Reed collapsed, his unfired revolver falling from nerveless fingers. 5 men left. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions. The Mercers and their remaining guns had triangulated on the church, were pouring fire into it from 3 sides. Windows shattered, wood splintered. The old building shook under the assault. Elias was already gone, sprinting for the nearest cover. The old land office, windows boarded up, door hanging crooked on broken hinges. He dove through the doorway as bullets chewed the ground behind him. Inside, he pressed his back against the wall and reloaded. 6 bullets into the Peacemaker's cylinder, smooth and fast. He'd done this in the dark, in the rain, in the middle of firefights. Muscle memory made it automatic. 6 shots, 5 men, 1 bullet margin for error. Through the broken windows, he could hear Silas shouting orders. "Pin him down! Miller, get a sight line on that building! Knuckles, circle around back! Cade, with me!" They were adapting, getting smarter. That meant the easy part was over. Elias surveyed the land office's interior, empty except for an old desk and filing cabinet stripped of their contents. 2 windows facing the street, one facing the alley behind. The back door was missing entirely, just an open frame. It was a terrible defensive position, which meant staying here was suicide, so he didn't plan to stay. He moved to the desk, tested its weight. Heavy oak, built when furniture was meant to outlast the people who owned it. With effort, he dragged it to the front window, positioned it as cover. Then he took off his coat and draped it over the desk's corner so a sleeve hung visible through the broken window. Old trick, simple trick. But simple tricks worked because people saw what they expected to see. Elias slipped out the back, moving low and fast. Behind him, he heard Miller's rifle crack, once, twice, bullets slamming into the desk where the coat sleeve suggested a man was crouched. He was 3 buildings away before they realized he'd gone. The afternoon sun was lower now, painting long shadows across Dry Hollow. The town remained shuttered, locked down, but Elias could feel the presence of watchers. People behind curtains, witnessing something they'd thought impossible. Someone fighting back. Someone winning. He needed to maintain that momentum, keep the pressure on, give them no time to regroup and reorganize. The Mercers' power came from fear and certainty. Take away the certainty, and the fear started to crack. Elias circled wide, heading for the stable where Charlie worked. The boy had fled hours ago, but the building remained. A large structure that housed a dozen horses, with a loft above for hay storage. He entered through a side door, moving quietly among the stalls. The horses shifted nervously, sensing his tension. He climbed to the loft and moved to the front opening where hay bales were loaded in. From here, he could see the street. Could see Knuckles approaching the land office's rear, gun ready. Could see Cade and Silas moving in from the front. Could see Miller repositioning, trying to get an angle on the building Elias had already left. And most importantly, he could see Brock Mercer standing alone near the horses, his massive frame radiating frustration and fury. Elias aimed carefully. Brock was maybe 80 feet away, long shot with a handgun, but doable if you understood trajectory and windage. The key was patience. Wait for the moment when the target was still, when the crosswind settled, when breath and heartbeat aligned. Brock turned, shouting something at Silas. Elias fired. The bullet caught Brock in the thigh, a deliberate choice. Kill shot would have been easier, but dead men don't scream, and screams create chaos. Brock went down hard, bellowing like a wounded bull, clutching his leg as blood spread through his pants. The remaining men spun toward the stable, and Elias was already moving, already down the loft ladder and heading for the back exit. Bullets tore through the hay bales where he'd been, sending showers of straw into the air. He emerged into the alley, ran east, vaulted a fence, and came out near the diner. Maggie was at her window and pulled back in shock when she saw him sprint past, blood on his sleeve from where Reed's bullet had grazed him, a wound so minor he'd barely noticed it in the heat of action. 4 men left standing, 1 wounded, 3 shots remaining in his gun. The math was almost even now. But even math meant nothing if he made a mistake. All it took was 1 bullet finding him, 1 moment of bad luck, or good shooting from his enemies, and those 3 coffins would need a 4th. Elias ducked into the narrow gap between the diner and the barber shop, pressed his back against the wall, and listened. Footsteps running, men shouting, the sound of Brock's agonized cursing. The chaos was working in his favor, but chaos was a tool that could cut both ways. He reloaded again. 3 bullets this time, bringing the peacemaker back to 6. Checked his wounds. The graze on his arm was bleeding, but not badly. His ribs hurt from the hard landing in the saddle shop. His hands were steady. The sun touched the horizon, painting Dry Hollow in shades of amber and blood. In the sheriff's office, Marcus Dawes stood at his window, with his badge in his hand, watching a lone man dismantle an empire piece by piece, and remembered what it felt like to believe in something. In the warehouse, Mara Dyer clutched her knife and felt hope rising in her chest like a drowned thing gasping for air. In homes throughout the town, people watched through cracks and gaps, witnessing the impossible, starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, tomorrow might be different than today. And in the street, 3 men and 1 wounded tyrant realized that the stranger who'd ordered 3 coffins wasn't running anymore. He was hunting. Silas Mercer stood in the middle of the street with a dying son at his back and a dying empire at his feet, doing the one thing he'd always done better than his brothers, calculating odds. The equation wasn't pretty. Jackson wounded, out of the fight. Carson unconscious in an alley, probably dead for all Silas knew. Torres and Reed both down, their blood already soaking into Dry Hollow's dust. Brock shot through the leg, bellowing like a stuck pig while Knuckles tried to stop the bleeding with a torn shirt. That left 3 guns. Himself, Cade, and Miller on the rooftop. 3 against 1 should still be favorable odds. Except this wasn't a normal one. "Cade!" Silas's voice cut through the chaos. "Stop wasting ammunition and think!" His younger brother had been firing into the stable's loft, punching holes in wood and hay but hitting nothing vital. Cade stopped, his face flushed with adrenaline and something that looked uncomfortably like fear. "He's like a damn ghost," Cade said. "Every time we get a bead on him." "He's not a ghost. He's just better at this than we are." The admission tasted like ash in Silas's mouth, but facts were facts, and denying them got you killed. He's been controlling the tempo from the start, choosing when and where to engage. We've been reacting. "So what do we do?" Knuckles called from where he was tending Brock. The big man's face was pale, shock setting in. The bullet had missed the major artery. Lucky. But he'd lost blood and his fighting days were done for today. Silas's mind raced through scenarios. They could retreat, regroup, come back with more men. But retreat meant showing weakness, and showing weakness in a town they'd ruled through fear meant the end of everything. People would talk, word would spread. The carefully constructed terror that kept Dry Hollow compliant would crack, and once it started cracking, it wouldn't stop. No. This had to end here, today, with Elias Crow dead in the street, and the town reminded that challenging the Mercers was suicide. "Miller!" Silas shouted toward the rooftop. "Can you see him?" "Negative. He's in the wind." "Then get down here. We're bunching up, making ourselves 1 target instead of 3. It went against Silas's every instinct, giving up the high ground, the range advantage, the ability to pin their enemy down with rifle fire. But Miller alone on that roof was just another isolated target for Crow to pick off. Better to consolidate, present a united front, make Crow come to them. Miller scrambled down from his perch, using the external stairs on the building's backside. 30 seconds later, he jogged into the street, rifle in hand, breathing hard. "What's the plan?" Miller was a professional, had fought in range wars and bank robberies, knew better than to panic. But even he couldn't quite hide the edge in his voice. "We end this." Silas pointed at the diner, the general store, the feed store, the cluster of buildings where Crow had last been seen. "He's in there somewhere, probably watching us right now. We flush him out. Set fire to the buildings if we have to." "Burn down half the town?" Cade's eyes widened. "Silas, that's necessary." Silas's voice was ice. "We've taken what we wanted from these people for 4 years. Time they remembered the cost of defiance." It was pure calculation dressed as strategy. Burn the buildings, smoke out Crow, kill him in the open. And if a few townspeople died in the flames, well, that just reinforced the lesson about what happened when you let strangers challenge the Mercers. "Knuckles, you stay with Brock. Get him to the doc's office. Everyone else, with me." They moved as a unit now, Silas, Cade, and Miller, weapons ready, covering each other's blind spots. Professional, coordinated, the way they should have been operating from the start instead of letting arrogance and anger dictate tactics. They were 20 feet from the diner when Maggie's door opened. Not kicked open or burst open, but simply opened with the calm deliberateness of a woman who'd made a decision and wouldn't be talked out of it. Maggie stood in the doorway, and in her hands was a Winchester rifle that had belonged to her second husband, the one who died fighting in the war. "That's far enough," she said. Silas stopped. Behind him, Cade's hand drifted toward his gun. "Maggie." Silas's voice was reasonable, the tone he used when convincing widows to sign over their property. "You don't want to do this. Put the rifle down and go back inside." "I've been going back inside for 4 years." Her voice shook, but the rifle didn't. "Watching, hiding, serving you coffee while you talked about who to hurt next. I'm done going inside." "You pull that trigger, you die. You know that, right?" "Maybe. But one of you dies with me. Maybe all of you, if I get lucky." She raised the rifle to her shoulder. "So ask yourselves, is it worth it?" Cade started to draw, but Silas threw out his arm, blocking him. This was a calculation too. They could kill Maggie, easily, probably, but one of them might die doing it. And even if they all survived, killing a woman in cold blood in front of the whole town, that changed the equation, made them look weak, desperate. "You're protecting him," Silas said. "A man you met this morning. I'm protecting what he represents. And what's that?" "The idea that you three bastards can bleed." The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. From windows along the street, curtains twitched. Other doors opened. Not much, just cracks, but enough. Saul appeared in the general store's entrance, his shotgun visible. Pete Harmon showed himself at the feed store window. One person standing up had given others the courage to do the same. Silas saw his empire cracking in real time and knew he had to stop it before the fractures spread. "This is your last warning, Maggie. Stand down or—" The shot came from behind them. Miller went down with the grunt of pain, his rifle clattering to the dirt. The bullet had taken him in the back of the shoulder, a through and through that wasn't fatal, but sure as hell was debilitating. Silas and Cade spun, guns coming up, scanning for the shooter. Elias stood in the middle of the street, 40 feet away, his peacemaker smoking in his hand. He must have circled all the way around, come up behind them while they were focused on Maggie. Now he stood between them and their horses, between them and escape. "Two left," Elias said quietly. "Last chance to walk away." Cade laughed, high and brittle. "Walk away? Brother, you just signed your death warrant." "Probably, but I'll have company." Elias's gray eyes found Cade's. "You're fast. Everyone says so. Fastest draw in 3 territories. 13 men dead by your hand. Maybe more if we count the ones nobody knows about." 14, Cade corrected. "You'll make 14. See, that's the thing about being fast." Elias started walking toward them, slow and steady, his gun held loose at his side. "Makes you confident. Confidence makes you predictable. And predictable gets you killed." Big talk from a dead man. We'll see. 30 feet between them now. The street had gone silent except for the sound of boots on dirt and Miller's labored breathing. Behind the Mercers, Maggie still held her rifle. Around them, the town watched with held breath. Silas's mind was racing. This was bad positioning. Crow ahead, Maggie behind, townspeople on both sides starting to grow brave. They needed to regain control, impose their will, make this fight happen on their terms. "Cade," Silas said quietly. "Take him." 25 feet. Cade's hand hovered over his revolver, fingers loose, ready. He'd practiced the draw 10,000 times, could pull and fire in under a second, had killed men who fancied themselves gunslingers, who traveled to Dry Hollow specifically to test themselves against the legendary Cade Mercer. Every one of them had died learning the difference between fast and fastest. 20 feet. "Your brother's bleeding out," Elias said conversationally. "Might want to get him to a doctor before he goes into shock." "He'll live long enough to watch you die," Cade replied. "You sound sure." "I've never lost." "Everyone loses eventually. It's just mathematics. One day you face someone faster, or someone smarter, or someone who doesn't play by the rules you expect." Elias stopped walking. 15 feet of dust and destiny separated them. "Today's that day." Cade's smile was pure predator. "Last words?" "Yeah." Elias's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried. 3 coffins. Just like I promised. Then everything happened at once. Cade's hand moved like lightning, a blur of motion that had ended 13 lives before those lives even registered the threat. His fingers closed around his revolver's grip, drew it from the holster in one fluid motion, thumb cocking the hammer as it cleared leather. He was fast. Faster than anyone Elias had ever seen. But Elias wasn't trying to outdraw him. Elias fired first because his gun was already in his hand, already aimed, already decided. While Cade's hand was still moving toward his holster, Elias squeezed the trigger. The bullet took Cade in the chest, center mass, punching through ribs and lung. Cade's draw completed anyway, muscle memory finishing what consciousness had started. But his shot went wide, the bullet kicking up dirt 3 feet to Elias's left. Cade stood there for a moment, his face registering shock, confusion, the terrible understanding that he'd been beaten not by someone faster, but by someone who'd changed the rules. He looked down at the spreading red on his shirt, then back up at Elias. You didn't draw. No, Elias agreed. I didn't. Cade fell. Behind him, Silas had his gun out now, was raising it, his face twisted with rage and grief, and the sudden terrible knowledge that this was actually happening. They were actually losing. The Empire was actually ending. He never got the shot off. Maggie's Winchester cracked. The bullet caught Silas in the right arm, spinning him, his own gun flying from nerveless fingers. He went to his knees, clutching his arm, blood welling between his fingers. That's for Thomas Whelan, Maggie said, her voice steady now, all the shaking gone. And his wife and everyone else you three destroyed. Elias walked forward, keeping his peacemaker trained on Silas. With his boot, he kicked Silas's fallen revolver away, sent it skittering across the street. It's over, Elias said. Silas looked up at him, and for the first time since they'd met, there was no calculation in his eyes, just raw, animal fear. You can't. We have money, connections. You kill me, and I'm not going to kill you. Elias glanced toward where Brock was still being tended by Knuckles. Either of you. That's not my job. Then what? My job was to break the thing that was broken. The rest... He looked toward the sheriff's office. The rest is up to the law. The door to the sheriff's office opened, and Marcus Dawes stepped out. He was wearing his badge again, polished now, catching the dying sunlight. In his hand was a pair of iron shackles. He walked with his head up, his back straight, looking like the man he'd been 4 years ago before fear had made him small. Silas Mercer. Dawes' voice rang out clear and strong. You're under arrest. You and your brother both. Conspiracy to murder, theft, extortion, assault, and about 24 other charges I'll be filing before sundown. You can't arrest us. Silas's voice was desperate now, the smooth calculation crumbling. We own this town. We own you. You did. Dawes knelt beside Silas and clamped the shackles around his wrists, the iron clicking shut with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Not anymore. Around the street, doors were opening fully now, people stepping out. Saul emerged from the general store, Pete from the feed store, Beth Carver from the boarding house with her daughter. A dozen others, 24, people who'd hidden and cowered and survived by submission for 4 long years. They surrounded the fallen Mercers and their wounded men, not threatening, not violent, just present. Witnessing. Reclaiming their town one brave step at a time. Elias walked to where Knuckles sat with Brock. The hired gun looked up, his hands red with his employer's blood, his eyes showing the calculation of a man deciding whether to fight or fold. Don't, Elias said quietly. You're not getting paid enough to die here. Knuckles looked at Brock, pale, sweating, his leg a mess of blood and torn fabric, then at Cade's corpse, then at Silas being shackled. He slowly raised his hands. Smart choice, Elias said. He turned to Dawes. This one helped them, but he didn't pull a trigger today. Arrest him if you want, or run him out of town. Your call. Get on your horse and ride, Dawes told Knuckles. If you're still in Dry Hollow in 10 minutes, I'll shoot you myself. Knuckles didn't need to be told twice. He was mounted and gone before Elias had finished checking on Miller and Jackson. Both men were hurt but would live, assuming they got proper medical attention. The town doctor, a thin man in his 60s named Wallace, who'd been forced to treat the Mercers' victims in silence, appeared with his bag. He looked at Elias, then at the wounded, then at the dead. I'll need help moving them, Wallace said. You'll have it. This came from Pete Harmon, and suddenly there were others volunteering. Men who'd been too scared to speak up an hour ago were now stepping forward, helping carry the wounded toward the doctor's office. Elias watched them work and felt the town transforming around him. Fear was leaving like a fever breaking, and in its place came something tentative but real, hope. Mara Dyer appeared at his elbow. Her face was flushed, her eyes bright. You actually did it. You actually... She stopped, unable to find words big enough for what had just happened. We did it, Elias corrected. Maggie, Saul, Pete, the sheriff finding his spine again. All I did was light the match. You all chose to let it burn. Still. She looked at Cade's body, being covered now with a sheet someone had brought. 3 coffins, just like you said. Only need 2 at the moment. Elias nodded toward where Silas and Brock were being hauled to their feet, headed for the jail. Those two get to face a judge. Let the law handle them proper. The law? Mara's voice was bitter. The law hasn't worked here in 4 years because people stopped believing in it. Start believing again, and it works fine. He looked at her. Your father's business, the debt they claimed you owed. None of it was legal. Real lawyer looks at the papers. He'll tear them apart. You'll get it all back. How do you know? Because men like the Mercers don't bother with legal documents. They bother with documents that look legal to scared people who don't know better. He touched his hat to her. Get yourself a real lawyer. File proper papers. Take back what's yours. Dawes had Silas and Brock locked in the jail's 2 cells now. Through the window, Elias could see the sheriff at his desk, writing with furious concentration, documenting everything while it was fresh, building the case that would see justice finally served. The sun touched the horizon, painting Dry Hollow in shades of orange and purple. The town's main street was still marked with blood and bullet holes, but the people walking it stood straighter than they had that morning. Morris appeared, the undertaker in his work clothes, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at Elias and smiled. Actually smiled, the first genuine smile Elias had seen from anyone in Dry Hollow except the children who were too young to understand what fear was. 2 coffins, Morris said. You were off by 1. Math changed during the execution. Elias glanced at Torres and Reed's bodies, being prepared for burial. Those 2 earned theirs fair and square. Cade too. And the other 2? Get to stand trial. Justice delayed but not denied. Morris nodded slowly. The town council's going to want to meet with you. Thank you properly. Probably offer you the sheriff's job, knowing them. Already got a sheriff? Elias looked toward the jail where Dawes was still writing. Better one than I'd ever be. Then what will you do? It was the question Elias had been asked in a dozen towns after a dozen fights, by a dozen grateful people who thought that fixing their problem meant he'd stay to make sure it stayed fixed. The answer was always the same. Move on. This town doesn't need me anymore. When? Dawn, probably, soon as I'm sure things are settled. Morris extended his hand. Elias shook it, a firm grip from a man who'd spent his life preparing the dead and had just watched the living reclaim their town from men who'd treated them like corpses. You're a strange man, Elias Crow, but I'm glad you drifted through. So am I. Elias walked to where his horse was still tied outside the diner. Seemed like a lifetime ago he'd dismounted there, though it had been less than 12 hours. The mare nickered softly, recognizing him, patient in the way horses are when their riders are reliable. Maggie came out of the diner carrying a plate of food and a cup of fresh coffee. You didn't eat all day. Figured you might be hungry. I am, thank you. She watched him eat, standing on the porch with her arms crossed. This woman who'd stood up with a rifle when standing up meant possibly dying. What you said earlier about me protecting what you represent, that was only half true. Elias looked up from his plate. What's the other half? You protected what I represent. What all of us represent. The people who just want to live decent lives without monsters, making it impossible. She paused. I should have done what you did 4 years ago, when Thomas was still alive. You did what you could with what you had. Survival isn't cowardice, Maggie. Sometimes it's the bravest thing there is. But today was braver. Today was different. Today you had an opening, and you took it. That rifle you pointed at them, that changed the math. Made them think twice. Gave the rest of the town courage. He set down the empty plate. Don't discount what you did. She was crying now, not from sadness, but from the release of 4 years of pent-up fear and anger and helplessness. Thank you for giving us the opening. Thank you for taking it. Would have been a lot harder without you. As night fell, the town held an impromptu gathering in the street. Not quite a celebration. The day had been too violent for that, but a moment of collective exhale. People talked quietly, made plans, started to imagine what tomorrow might look like without the Mercers' shadow over everything. Elias stayed on the periphery, watching. This was their moment, their town, their future. He was just the catalyst, the spark that started the reaction. What came next belonged to them. Sheriff Dawes approached, walking with the steady confidence of a man who'd found himself again. I sent a telegram to the territorial judge. He'll be here in 3 days to hear the case against the Mercers. Between my testimony, the town's testimony, and the evidence I've been documenting, those two won't see freedom again. Good. Elias glanced toward the jail. They give you any trouble? Brock's too weak. Silas is too smart. He knows the game's over. Dawes looked at Elias with something like wonder. How'd you do it? 1 man against 9? Wasn't 1 man. Was a town ready to fight back that just needed someone to throw the first punch. Elias paused. And I've done this before. Learned some things about how men like the Mercers think. Use that against them. Where'd you learn that? Experience. Some of it my own. Most of it from watching other men fail and figuring out why. Dawes absorbed this. You planning to stay? Town could use someone like you. Town's got someone like me. He's wearing a badge and finally remembering how to use it. I mean someone to... I know what you mean. Elias's voice was gentle but firm. And I appreciate it. But this isn't my home. Never was. I'm just passing through, same as always. Where to next? Wherever the next broken thing needs fixing. He looked at the sheriff. You got anyone you trust? Someone who could be a deputy? Help you rebuild the law here? Dawes thought for a moment. Charlie, the kid who works the stable. His father was a lawman before he died. Boy's got potential, just needs someone to believe in him. Then believe in him. Give him a badge. Teach him what you know. Build something that lasts beyond 1 man. They talked into the night, Dawes asking questions about procedure and law enforcement, Elias sharing what he'd learned from a dozen towns and 100 hard lessons. By the time they parted, the sheriff had pages of notes and a clarity of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Elias made one more stop before finding a place to sleep. The North Cemetery was quiet under a sky thick with stars. He found Thomas Whelan's grave easily. It was the one with fresh flowers despite being 4 years old. Someone, probably Maggie, had been tending it all this time. The marker was simple. Thomas Whelan, deputy, died doing what was right. Next to it was the grave of his wife, Sarah Whelan, died of a broken heart. Elias stood there for a long moment, hat in hand, looking at the stones that marked where good people had been broken by evil ones. It's settled, he said quietly to the dead. Not perfect, not complete, but settled enough. They'll face a judge. Town's got its spine back. Your death meant something, Thomas. Just took 4 years for the meaning to come clear. The wind moved through the cemetery grass, and somewhere a nightbird called. Elias placed a coin on Thomas's marker, an old tradition, a way of saying the debt had been paid. Then he walked back toward town, toward the stable where he'd arranged to sleep in the loft for a few hours before dawn. The town was quiet now, people in their homes, probably sleeping sounder than they had in years. Guards were posted at the jail. Volunteers. Men who'd found courage they didn't know they had. The street was empty except for shadows and starlight. Elias climbed to the stable's loft, found a comfortable spot in the hay, and lay down with his peacemaker within reach. Old habits died hard, and sleeping unarmed was a good way to not wake up. He thought about the day, about the 9 men who'd faced him, and the 3 who wouldn't see another sunrise, about the 2 brothers in jail cells who'd built an empire on fear and watched it crumble in an afternoon, about a town that had forgotten how to stand and then remembered all at once. The math had worked out. The coffins were filled, the broken thing was fixed. Tomorrow he'd ride out, find another town, another problem, another group of people who needed someone to show them that fear wasn't permanent. But tonight, in this place, in this moment, Dry Hollow was free. And that was enough. Elias woke before dawn to the sound of voices rising in the street below, and for a half-second his hand was on his peacemaker before his mind caught up with his instincts. The voices weren't panicked or angry. They were excited, purposeful, alive in a way this town hadn't been in years. He climbed down from the loft and stepped into the cool pre-dawn air. The street was already active despite the hour. Saul was sweeping the boardwalk in front of his store, actually whistling while he worked. Pete Harmon was hauling crates, setting up a display he'd probably been too scared to bother with when the Mercers might decide to smash it for entertainment. Even the blacksmith, a thick-shouldered man named Garrett, whose broken fingers were splinted but healing, was attempting to light his forge one-handed, determined to get back to work. The town was waking up, and for the first time in 4 years, it was waking up to possibility instead of dread. Maggie was already at the diner, visible through the window as she prepared for the morning crowd. When she saw Elias, she waved him over with a gesture that said breakfast wasn't optional. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon filled the air. 3 other people were already eating, early risers or people who'd been too wired from yesterday's events to sleep properly. They nodded to Elias with a mixture of gratitude and awkwardness, not quite sure how to act around a man who'd killed 3 people in their street less than 24 hours ago. Elias took his usual seat, not the Mercers table this time, just a spot by the window where he could see the street, and Maggie brought him coffee without asking. "Eggs and bacon?" she asked. "Please." "And Maggie?" "Don't make it special. Regular portions. I'm not a hero, just hungry." She smiled at that, understanding what he meant. The last thing he wanted was to be elevated to mythical status. That's how you got trapped in a town, became the thing everyone depended on, lost the ability to move on when the work was done. While he ate, Sheriff Dawes came in looking like he'd been up all night. Probably had been, given the paperwork required to properly document everything that had happened. He poured himself coffee and sat across from Elias without invitation. "Couldn't sleep?" Elias asked. "Didn't try. Too much to do." Dawes pulled out a folded telegram from his pocket. "Judge Morrison confirmed. He'll be here tomorrow afternoon instead of 3 days from now. Seems word's already spreading about what happened here, and he wants to move fast before any of the Mercers' connections try to interfere." "They have connections?" "Had. Past tense." Dawes took a long drink of coffee. Silas kept records. Very detailed records. Turns out he was blackmailing half the territory's political class, and had dirt on 3 judges, 2 senators, and a railroad executive. He was documenting everything, probably planning to use it if he ever needed leverage. That's either very smart or very stupid. Both, depending on perspective. Smart because it gave him power. Stupid because now all that evidence is in my hands, and every single person he had leverage over is suddenly very motivated to see him hang. Dawes smiled grimly. Nothing makes corrupt men virtuous faster than the threat of exposure. Elias considered this while finishing his eggs. "What about Brock? How's he doing?" "Dr. Wallace says he'll live. The bullet missed the femoral artery by maybe an inch. Any closer and he'd have bled out in the street." Dawes paused. "You aimed for that spot deliberately, didn't you?" "Wanted him alive to stand trial. Dead men don't face justice, they just become stories." "Well, he's alive and he's talking. Trying to make a deal, offering to testify against Silas if we go easier on him." "Will you?" Dawes' face hardened. "Not my decision. But if I had my way?" "No. They ruled this town together. They can face the consequences together." The door opened and Charlie walked in, and Elias barely recognized him. The scared kid who'd run from the diner yesterday morning was gone, replaced by someone who stood straighter, walked with purpose. He was wearing a deputy's badge that looked freshly polished. "Sheriff," Charlie said, then nodded to Elias. "Mr. Crow, the morning patrol's complete. No problems. Jackson's still at the doc's office under guard. Miller's stable enough to be moved to a cell." Dawes nodded approvingly. "Good work, Charlie. Take a break, get some breakfast." The young man beamed at the praise and headed for the counter. Elias caught Dawes' eye and saw the calculation there. The sheriff building something sustainable, creating a law enforcement presence that would outlast any single person. "You gave him the badge," Elias observed. "Like you suggested. Kid's got good instincts, needs training, but he wants to do right. That counts for more than experience sometimes. His father would be proud." "Hope so." Dawes lowered his voice. "I've been thinking about what you said, about building something that lasts, so I'm putting together a proper town council. Real elections, not the puppet show Silas ran. We're going to draft actual laws, establish real governance, make it so 1 man or 3 men can never take over like this again." "That's good thinking." "It's your thinking. I'm just implementing it." Dawes studied Elias over his coffee cup. "You've done this before, more than once." It wasn't a question, but Elias answered anyway. "Few times." "How many towns?" "Lost count somewhere around a dozen." "And you just move on? Every time?" "Every time. The work I do is temporary, removing the immediate problem. What comes after, the building, the sustaining, the actual living, that's not my skill set." Elias pushed his empty plate away. "I'm good at breaking things that need to be broken. but I'm not much use for anything that requires staying still. Dawes absorbed this with the thoughtful silence of a man who understood there were different kinds of purpose in the world. When do you leave? Soon. Maybe after the judge arrives. See that things are settled proper. But soon. There'll be people who want you to stay, offer you positions, money, land. There always are. The answer's always the same. Which is? Grateful, but no. Elias stood, placed coins on the table for his meal. This town's got what it needs now. Sheriff who remembers his duty. People who remembered their courage. Systems starting to rebuild. Me staying would just make you dependent on something that isn't sustainable. You could teach. You don't need teaching. You know what to do. You just forgot for a while, and yesterday helped you remember. Elias put on his hat. Besides, there's another town out there somewhere that needs what you already have, and I need to find it. Outside, the sun was cresting the eastern ridge, painting Dry Hollow in shades of gold and amber. The street that had been a battlefield yesterday was already being cleaned, women sweeping away the dust and debris, men repairing the bullet holes in their buildings, everyone participating in the act of restoration. Elias walked toward the jail, wanting to see the Mercers one last time before the judge arrived. Not from any sense of triumph or vindication, but from the simple need to confirm that the thing he'd come to fix was truly fixed. The jail was a solid structure, stone foundation, thick walls, bars that were actually iron instead of the decorative garbage some frontier towns used. Dawes had been a real lawman once, and even during his years of compromise, he'd maintained the infrastructure properly. Maybe some part of him had always hoped he'd need it again. Inside, the office smelled of old coffee and newer resolve. 2 guards sat at the desk, men from town who'd volunteered for shifts, who took the responsibility seriously. They nodded to Elias, and one of them unlocked the door to the cell area. The jail had 4 cells, but only 3 were occupied. Silas was in the first, sitting on his bunk with his wounded arm bandaged, staring at the wall with the 1,000-yard gaze of a man watching his entire world collapse in slow motion. Brock was in the second, leg elevated, face pale from blood loss and shock. Miller occupied the third, shoulder wrapped, looking resigned to whatever came next. Jackson had been moved to a 4th location once Dr. Wallace had stabilized him, under guard in a spare room at the boarding house. Not going anywhere, but not exactly a prisoner in the same way these 3 were. Silas looked up when Elias entered. For a long moment they just stared at each other. The man who'd built an empire and the man who'd torn it down. Come to gloat? Silas's voice was hoarse. Come to make sure you're still here. Where would I go? Your sheriff's very thorough. Silas gestured at his bandaged arm. And I'm apparently very popular. Half the territory wants me hanged, and the other half wants me imprisoned for life, so they can enjoy knowing I'm suffering. You earned both. I suppose I did. Silas laughed, a sound without humor. The funny thing is I saw you coming. Not you specifically, but the idea of you. I told Brock years ago that we were building something unsustainable, that fear only works until someone isn't afraid. But he didn't listen, and Cade... He trailed off, grief flickering across his face. Cade just enjoyed the violence too much to think about consequences. Your brother's dead because he was confident in his speed. My brother's dead because you were smarter than he was, than all of us were. Silas stood, walked to the bars, studied Elias like a specimen. Who are you really? Not just a name. What makes a man ride into a town he's never seen and decide to dismantle it from the inside? Elias considered the question. Most people never asked it. They just accepted that he'd helped and moved on. But Silas was different, his mind always calculating, always seeking the angle. I'm someone who sees what's broken and fixes it. That's all. That's not all. There's a dozen broken things in every town and every territory. You don't fix them all, so why this one? Why us? Timing. Coincidence. Does it matter? It matters to me. I'm trying to understand how a man I'd never heard of destroyed in one day what took me 4 years to build. You want the truth? Elias moved closer to the bars, close enough that he could see the bloodshot quality of Silas's eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly from pain or fear or both. Your empire was already broken, had been from the start. You built it on fear and violence, and those are foundations made of sand. All I did was show the town that the foundation was false, that you three were just men, not monsters, that they could push back. And they did. They did. Maggie with her rifle, Saul standing in his doorway, Pete watching from his window. All I provided was the opening. They chose to step through it. Silas turned this over in his mind, his expression showing the gears turning even now, even in a cell, even facing justice. If I'd handled it differently, you'd have lost anyway. Maybe not yesterday. Maybe not this month. But eventually. Elias's voice was quiet but certain. Empires built on cruelty always fall. It's just mathematics. You hurt enough people, eventually someone hurts you back. In the next cell, Brock stirred. His eyes opened, focused on Elias with hatred so pure it was almost physical. You, Brock's voice was a rasp. You shot me. You were threatening to burn down buildings with people in them. Seemed like the proportional response. I'm going to kill you. Soon as I get out of here, I'm going to find you, and you're not getting out of here. Elias said it with the same certainty he'd said everything else, the absolute knowledge of an inevitable outcome. You're going to stand trial, you're going to be convicted, and you're going to hang or spend the rest of your life in a territorial prison. Those are your options. The hell they are. We've got connections, money. Had connections, had money, past tense. Elias nodded toward Silas. Your brother kept records, very detailed records, and now every single person you had leverage over is running away from you as fast as they can. You're not powerful anymore, Brock. You're just a wounded man in a cell, facing justice for the first time in your life. Brock's face went purple, veins standing out on his forehead. He tried to stand, to lunge at the bars, but his wounded leg gave out and he crashed back onto the bunk with a howl of pain and frustration. Elias turned back to Silas. You're the smart one. Explain it to him. Make him understand that fighting this only makes it worse. He won't listen to me. He never has. Silas's voice carried a lifetime of fraternal frustration. Brock's solution to every problem is violence. It worked for him for 42 years. Hard to teach old dogs new tricks. Then he'll learn the hard way. Elias left them there. Two brothers in adjoining cells, their empire reduced to 8 by 10 feet of iron and stone, their future measured in trials and sentences instead of power and plunder. Outside, the morning was advancing toward noon. The town was fully awake now, people going about their business with an energy that felt almost frantic, like they were trying to pack 4 years of deferred living into a single day. Mara Dyer found him near the livery stable where he was checking on his horse. The mare was well fed and rested, ready for the next leg of whatever journey came next. Mr. Crow, Mara said, slightly breathless like she'd been hurrying, I wanted to catch you before you disappeared. I heard you're leaving soon. Probably tomorrow, after the judge arrives. Right, the judge. She twisted her hands together, nervous energy seeking outlet. I wanted to thank you for what you said yesterday about my father's business, about getting a lawyer. You find one? Sending a telegram today to a firm in Denver. Dawes recommended them. Says they're honest, which apparently is rare. She smiled tentatively. If they can unravel the documents Silas forged, I might actually get the business back, free and clear. They will. Silas was good at making things look legal, but there's a difference between looking legal and being legal. Real lawyer will spot the discrepancies. Even so, she paused, gathering courage for whatever came next. I wanted to ask if you'd consider staying, just for a while. The business is going to need rebuilding, and I could use someone with your particular skills. I'm not a freight manager. No, but you're good at fixing broken things, and that business is very broken. She rushed on before he could interrupt. I could pay you, not much at first, but once things get running again. Mara. His voice was gentle but firm. This is your business, your legacy, your chance to build something that's truly yours. You don't need me for that. You need yourself. But I don't know how to. Yes, you do. You've been running it under impossible conditions for years. Now you get to run it without someone's boot on your neck. Trust yourself. You'll be fine. She looked like she wanted to argue, but something in his expression stopped her. Instead, she nodded slowly. Will you at least stay for dinner tonight? The town's organizing something. A meal for everyone, a way to I don't know, come together properly? Elias hesitated. He didn't like attention, didn't enjoy being the center of gratitude, but refusing would be churlish, and these people deserved their moment of community. All right, he said. Dinner, but I'm not making speeches. Wouldn't dream of asking. The rest of the day passed in a strange suspension between what had been and what would be. Elias walked the town's perimeter one more time, not for tactical reasons now, but just to see it properly, to memorize what it looked like when hope was being rebuilt from rubble. He stopped at the cemetery again, paying respects to the graves of people who'd stood up and paid the price for it. Thomas Whelan, his wife Sarah, others who'd died over the years, victims of the Mercers' cruelty. The markers were weathered but maintained. Someone, probably several someones, had been tending them even during the worst years. That told him something important about Dry Hollow. It had never truly surrendered. Parts of it had bent, had hidden, had survived through compromise. But some core of it had remained intact, had kept faith even when faith seemed foolish. Those were the parts that would rebuild properly. At sunset, the town gathered in the street in front of the diner. Tables had been set up, every table anyone could find, arranged in a long line that stretched half the block. Food appeared from everywhere. Dishes people had been saving, ingredients they'd been hoarding, meals prepared with the kind of care that comes from finally having something to celebrate. Maggie presided over it all like a general commanding an army, directing placement and timing with the precision of someone who'd been imagining this moment for 4 years. Elias tried to stay on the periphery, but people kept approaching, thanking him, offering hands to shake, tears to shed, stories to tell about what the last 4 years had been like and how different tomorrow felt. He accepted it all with quiet grace, understanding that they needed this, needed to externalize the gratitude, to make it tangible through words and gestures. So he listened to Saul talk about the merchandise the Mercers had stolen over the years. Listened to Pete describe watching his father die after refusing to pay protection money. Listened to Beth Carver explain how she'd almost left Dry Hollow entirely, had packed bags twice, but couldn't abandon the home she and her late husband had built. Each story was a piece of the town's collective trauma, and by sharing them in the open air instead of whispered corners, people were reclaiming them, transforming them from sources of shame into badges of survival. Sheriff Dawes stood eventually, calling for quiet. The conversations dimmed. "I'm not much for speeches," Dawes said, which got a few laughs since everyone knew that was true. "But I want to say something. 4 years ago, we lost our way. We let fear make us small. We let bad men tell us that wrong was right, and we believed them because fighting back seemed impossible." He paused, looking around at the assembled faces. But it wasn't impossible. It was just hard. And yesterday we remembered that hard isn't the same as impossible. Some of that remembering came from a stranger who showed us what courage looks like. But most of it came from ourselves. From Maggie, standing in her doorway with a rifle. From Saul and Pete and everyone else who chose to stop hiding. Heads turned toward Maggie, who blushed but didn't look away. "Tomorrow, a judge arrives," Dawes continued. "He'll hear the evidence against the Mercer brothers and render judgment. I believe that judgment will be harsh, because the law, real law, not the twisted thing we've been living under, demands it. But whether they hang or rot in prison, the important thing is this. We took our town back. We chose to stand up, and we'll choose to stay standing every day from now on." Applause rippled through the crowd, not wild or celebratory, but solid and sustained. The sound of people affirming a truth they'd fought to reclaim. Dawes raised a hand for silence. "One more thing. Elias Crow will be leaving us soon. He's not interested in thanks or monuments or any of the things we'd like to give him. But I think we owe him the truth, spoken plain. Mr. Crow, you came to a broken town and gave us the tools to fix ourselves. That's a debt we can't repay, but we'll honor it by building something worth your effort, something that lasts." More applause, louder this time. Elias stood because it seemed required, nodded his acknowledgement, and sat back down as quickly as possible. He'd meant what he told Mara. He wasn't making speeches. The meal continued into the evening, lamplight and starlight mixing as people ate and talked, and slowly, carefully, allowed themselves to believe that tomorrow might actually be better than today. Elias sat with Maggie, Saul, Pete, and a few others, listening more than talking, absorbing the texture of a community knitting itself back together. These were good people who'd been forced into bad choices, and now they were finding their way back to themselves. Around 9 o'clock, a rider came in fast from the east, dismounting in a cloud of dust near the sheriff's office. Dawes excused himself from the gathering and went to meet him. 5 minutes later, he returned with a telegram in his hand and a grim expression on his face. "What is it?" Maggie asked. "Judge Morrison's been delayed, not arriving tomorrow after all." Dawes looked at the telegram like it might bite him. Apparently there's some legal challenge being filed. Someone with connections trying to get the case moved to a different jurisdiction. "The Mercers' connections?" Elias asked. "Has to be. Even locked up, they've got enough leverage left to make trouble." "Will it work?" "Depends. Morrison's a tough old bastard, doesn't like being pushed around. But if someone with enough power leans on him," Dawes trailed off, "could delay things by weeks, maybe months." The mood at the gathering shifted, hope curdling into worry. This was the fear every frontier town lived with, that justice could be delayed, corrupted, or denied by people with more money and power than principles. Elias stood. "Sheriff, a word?" They walked away from the gathering into the shadows near the stable where conversations couldn't be overheard. "How solid is your case?" Elias asked. "Very. Multiple witnesses, physical evidence, Silas's own records documenting crimes. Any honest judge would convict in an hour." Keyword being honest. "Yeah." Dawes looked tired, the weight of possibilities settling on shoulders that had just started to straighten. If they managed to get this move to a corrupt jurisdiction, or delay long enough that witnesses get scared and disappear, then you make sure that doesn't happen. "How? I'm just a small-town sheriff. I don't have the kind of power to fight territorial politics." Elias thought for a moment, calculating options the way he'd calculated angles of fire yesterday afternoon. "Silas's records. The ones documenting his blackmail operation. You still have them?" "In the safe at my office." "Get them to Judge Morrison. Directly. Not through official channels where they might get intercepted or buried. Hire a writer you trust and send them tonight." "What good will that do?" "Those records prove that everyone trying to interfere with this case has a vested interest in seeing Silas go free. Once Morrison knows he's being manipulated, he'll dig in. Judges hate being played." Elias paused. "And make copies first. Send one set to the territorial governor, another to the nearest federal marshal. Spread the information too wide to suppress." Dawes's eyes lit up with understanding. "Turn their own leverage against them." "Exactly. They've been using secrets as weapons for years. Time to weaponize those secrets in a different direction." "That's..." Dawes grinned. "That's actually brilliant. Devious, but brilliant. Learned from watching men like Silas. Only difference is I use the tactics for fixing things instead of breaking them." Within the hour, 3 riders left Dry Hollow in different directions, each carrying sealed documents that would make very powerful people very nervous. Dawes had chosen his messengers carefully. People who'd lost family to the Mercers, who had personal stakes in seeing justice served, who wouldn't be bribed or intimidated. The gathering broke up shortly after, people heading home with full bellies and cautiously renewed spirits. The legal maneuvering was concerning, but Dawes had been clear. They'd fight it every step of the way, and they had tools now they didn't have yesterday. Elias returned to the stable loft, settled into the hay, and tried to sleep, but his mind kept turning over possibilities, calculating what might go wrong and how to mitigate it. This was the dangerous part, the aftermath, when the immediate threat was gone, but the structural problems remained. When people who'd been afraid to act suddenly found courage they hadn't known they possessed, when systems had to be rebuilt from broken pieces. He'd seen it go right in some towns, seen it go terribly wrong in others. The difference usually came down to whether the people involved believed in something larger than their own fear. Dry Hollow believed. He'd seen it in their eyes during the gathering, heard it in their voices as they talked about tomorrow. They'd tasted freedom from tyranny, and that taste had reminded them of who they used to be. That was usually enough. Usually. The riders returned 3 days later, and the news they brought transformed everything. Judge Morrison had received the documents personally, read them through the night, and was reportedly furious at the attempt to manipulate his court. The territorial governor, a man who'd been quietly taking bribes from Silas for 2 years, suddenly found himself under federal investigation. 2 senators whose names appeared in the blackmail files resigned within 48 hours, citing health concerns that fooled no one. The railroad executive who'd been using Mercer muscle to intimidate homesteaders was arrested on fraud charges. The corruption network that Silas had built so carefully, that had seemed so impenetrable, collapsed like a house of cards once the cards were made public. Judge Morrison arrived in Dry Hollow on the 4th day after the shootout, riding in a proper carriage with a clerk and a federal marshal as escort. He was a man in his late 60s with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen every trick lawyers and criminals could devise. He took one look at the town, at the bullet holes still visible in some buildings, at the way people watched him with desperate hope, and his jaw set in a way that suggested decisions had already been made. The trial was held in the church, the only building large enough to accommodate everyone who wanted to witness it. The pews were packed, people standing in the aisles and crowding the doorway. This wasn't entertainment, this was validation. This was the town collectively bearing witness to justice being served after 4 years of justice being denied. Elias sat in the back, hat in his lap, watching proceedings with the quiet attention of someone who understood that this moment mattered more than any gunfight. Violence could break a tyranny, but only law could keep it broken. Brock was brought in first, legs still bandaged, hobbling between two guards. His face was a mask of barely controlled rage, but the iron shackles on his wrists and ankles made the rage impotent. He was seated at a table with a court-appointed lawyer, a young man from the next town over who looked terrified to be defending a Mercer, but determined to do his job properly. Silas came next, arms still in a sling, walking with the careful precision of a man conserving strength for a fight he knew he couldn't win but would fight anyway. His lawyer was older, more experienced, wearing an expression that said he understood exactly how bad the situation was for his client. Judge Morrison gavelled the proceedings to order. The church fell silent. This court is convened to hear charges against Brock Mercer and Silas Mercer. Morrison's voice carried to every corner of the building. The charges are extensive: murder, conspiracy to commit murder, theft, extortion, arson, assault, and corruption of public officials. Gentlemen, how do you plead? Silas's lawyer stood. His lawyer: Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty and requests that this trial be moved to a more appropriate venue where request denied. Morrison didn't even look up from his papers. I've read your motion and the 7 others filed on your client's behalf. All denied. This trial happens here, now, in front of the people these men terrorized. Your Honor, that's highly irregular. So is attempting to blackmail a territorial judge. Morrison's eyes found Silas. Did you really think those documents you kept would protect you forever? All you did was create the evidence that will hang you. Silas's face went pale. His lawyer tried again. Your Honor, I must protest. Protest noted and overruled. Now sit down, counsel, and let's proceed with justice. The prosecution was handled by the territorial attorney general himself, a barrel-chested man named Hamilton who'd made the trip specifically for this case. Word had spread about what happened in Dry Hollow, and powerful people wanted to demonstrate that frontier towns weren't lawless wastelands where tyrants could operate with impunity. Hamilton's opening statement was devastating. He laid out 4 years of systematic brutality in precise, documented detail. Named names, cited dates, presented evidence that Silas himself had meticulously recorded. Then came the witnesses. Maggie testified about Thomas Whelan's death, her voice steady, despite the tears streaming down her face. She described how the deputy had intervened in a beating, how the Mercers had threatened him, how his body had been found 3 days later with 6 bullet wounds. Saul testified about the protection racket, about being forced to hand over 20% of his revenue every month or face having his store burned down. He produced 4 years of ledgers showing the payments, every entry marked in his own hand because Silas had demanded documentation. Pete Harmon testified about his father's death, about the manufactured debt that had enslaved his family, about watching his father work himself into an early grave trying to pay off money he'd never actually borrowed. Beth Carver testified about the young women in town who'd been targeted by Brock, about the ones who'd disappeared after rejecting his advances, about the climate of fear that made half the town's female population afraid to walk alone after dark. Dr. Wallace testified about the injuries he'd treated: broken bones, knife wounds, gunshot wounds, and the number of times he'd been ordered to list cause of death as accident or natural causes, when everyone knew the truth. The testimony went on for hours, person after person standing up, finding their voice, speaking truth to power in a way they hadn't been able to do for 4 years. Brock sat through it with mounting rage, his face getting redder, his hands clenching and unclenching until the guards moved closer, ready to restrain him if he tried something stupid. Silas listened with the expression of a mathematician watching an equation prove him wrong, disbelief mixed with dawning horror at the magnitude of what he'd done. Hamilton presented Silas's own records as evidence, page after page of documented crimes, blackmail targets, payoff schedules, violent incidents. It was a masterclass in self-incrimination, every detail recorded by a man who'd thought he was building insurance when he was actually writing his own conviction. The defense tried. Both lawyers did their jobs as well as they could under impossible circumstances. They argued that their clients had been providing security to a lawless town, that the protection payments were voluntary, that the deaths attributed to the Mercers couldn't be proven beyond reasonable doubt. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Judge Morrison wasn't inclined to give them benefit of any doubts. The trial lasted 2 days. On the evening of the second day, Morrison called for closing arguments. Hamilton stood and spoke for 20 minutes, his voice ringing through the church as he summarized the prosecution's case. He ended with words that would be repeated in Dry Hollow for generations. These men didn't bring order to chaos. They brought chaos to order. They took a functioning town and turned it into a kingdom of fear. The question before this court is simple. Do we let them keep that kingdom, or do we take it back in the name of law and justice? Silas's lawyer gave a competent closing argument about reasonable doubt and the burden of proof, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. He knew what verdict was coming. Brock's lawyer simply stood and said, "My client maintains his innocence and throws himself on the mercy of the court." Judge Morrison looked at both defendants. "Gentlemen, you have the right to make statements before I render judgment. Do you wish to exercise that right?" Brock stood, shaking off his lawyer's attempt to keep him seated. "This whole thing is a sham. We brought order to this town. We made it safe. And this is the thanks we get? A kangaroo court and a lying judge?" "Mr. Mercer," Morrison's voice was ice, "I suggest you sit down before you add contempt of court to your charges." "I ain't sitting down for nothing. You want to convict me? Go ahead. But don't pretend this is justice. This is revenge, pure and simple." "Sit down." Brock sat, but his face promised violence to anyone within reach. Morrison turned to Silas. "Mr. Mercer, do you have anything to say?" Silas stood slowly, his wounded arm held carefully against his body. For a long moment, he just looked around the church at all the faces staring back at him with hatred, fear, and grim satisfaction. "I thought I was building something," he said quietly. "An empire. A legacy. Turned out I was just building a prison, and I locked myself inside it along with everyone else." He paused. "I'm not asking for mercy. I know what I did. I documented all of it because I thought knowledge was power. Turns out, it's just evidence." He sat back down, and something about the resignation in his posture suggested he'd already accepted what came next. Judge Morrison took a breath. In the matter of the territory versus Brock and Silas Mercer, having heard testimony from multiple witnesses, having reviewed extensive documentary evidence, and having observed the defendant's demeanor and statements, this court finds both defendants guilty on all charges. The church erupted, people cheering, crying, hugging each other. 4 years of suppressed emotion pouring out in a wave of collective relief. Morrison gavelled for order. It took 3 tries before the crowd quieted. "Sentencing will be rendered immediately," Morrison said. "Brock Mercer, for your crimes of murder. And make no mistake, the death of Thomas Whelan and 6 others can be directly attributed to your actions, as well as assault, extortion, and conspiracy. You are hereby sentenced to death by hanging, sentenced to be carried out 1 week from today." Brock lunged to his feet, roaring, trying to reach the judge. Guards tackled him, forced him back into his chair, held him there while he struggled and cursed. Morrison waited for the commotion to subside. "Silas Mercer, for your crimes of conspiracy to commit murder, extortion, blackmail, theft, and corruption, you are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. You will be transferred to the territorial prison immediately following this proceeding and will remain there until you die." Silas didn't react, just sat there staring at his hands, the hands that had signed so many documents, that had built an empire on paper, and watched it burn in a courtroom. Court is adjourned. Morrison's gavel fell one final time. Guards moved to remove the prisoners. Brock fought them every step, had to be physically dragged from the church while screaming threats and obscenities. Silas walked out under his own power, head down, already looking like a ghost of the man who'd ruled Dry Hollow. Outside, the town was celebrating. Not wildly, not drunkenly, but with the quiet satisfaction of people who'd fought for something and won. Justice had been served. The law had worked. Tomorrow would be different because today had been right. Elias slipped away from the crowd, heading back toward the stable. His work here was done. The trial was concluded. The Mercers would face their sentences, and Dry Hollow had its future back. He was checking his horse's saddle when Sheriff Dawes found him. "You're leaving," Dawes said. "Not a question. First light tomorrow." "You could stay for the hanging. Brock's execution is in a week." "Don't need to watch a man die to know justice was served." Elias adjusted a stirrup strap. "Besides, you don't need me for that. You've got everything handled." "We do. Thanks to you." Dawes leaned against a post, watching Elias work. "I talked to Charlie today. Kid wants to make this his life. Being a lawman. Asked me to teach him everything I know." "You will. He'll be good at it." "I'm appointing 2 more deputies. A woman named Sarah Hendricks, tough as nails, good head on her shoulders. And old Garrett once his fingers heal. Between the 4 of us, we'll keep this town safe." "Good." Elias moved to check the mare's hooves, picking out a stone. "What about the town council?" "Elections scheduled for next month. Real elections with ballots and everything. Mara's running. So is Saul. Figure we'll have actual representation for the first time in years. Mara will do well. She's got her father's spine in her own brain. That's a good combination." She got the lawyer from Denver. They're untangling the Mercers' property seizures. Looks like about 30 families will get their land back, including hers. Dawes paused. "She asked me to tell you that. Said you'd want to know." "I did. Thank you." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. 2 men who understood that some things didn't need words. "Where will you go?" Dawes asked finally. "West, probably. Maybe north. Wherever the next broken thing needs fixing." "You ever think about stopping? Finding a place and staying?" "Sometimes. Usually around dawn when a town's quiet and the coffee's hot, and I can pretend I'm the kind of man who builds instead of breaks." Elias straightened, met Dawes' eyes. "But that's not who I am. I'm the man who shows up when everything's gone wrong, when staying would just make people dependent on me instead of themselves." "You underestimate what you do. It's not just breaking tyranny, it's giving people permission to believe again." "Maybe. But the believing part, that's all them. I just removed the obstacle." Dawes pulled something from his pocket. It was a badge, identical to his own. "Town council authorized me to offer you this, honorary deputy. Thought you might want something to remember us by." Elias looked at the badge for a long moment. It was just metal and cloth, but it represented something larger, recognition, gratitude, belonging. He'd been offered similar things in other towns, usually declined. This time, he took it. "Thank you, Sheriff. I'll keep it close." "You do that." Dawes extended his hand. "And if you ever do decide to stop wandering, there's a place for you here. Always will be." They shook, 2 men bound by shared purpose, if not shared path. After Dawes left, Elias sat in the loft and pulled out the badge, turning it over in his hands. The metal caught the lamplight from the street, throwing small reflections on the hay-covered floor. He thought about the towns he'd been to, the people he'd helped, the ones he'd failed because there had been failures, times when he'd arrived too late, or the situation had been beyond fixing, or good people had died despite his best efforts. Dry Hollow wouldn't be one of the failures. This town would survive, would thrive, probably. The people had remembered who they were, and that memory would sustain them through whatever challenges came next. That night, he slept deeply for the first time since arriving, the kind of sleep that comes when a job is truly done. Morning arrived with a soft gray light filtering through the loft's cracks. Elias woke, packed his few belongings, and prepared to leave the same way he'd arrived, quietly, without fanfare, already thinking about the road ahead. But when he led his horse into the street, he found it wasn't quite that simple. The town had turned out. Not everyone, but enough. Maggie stood on the diner's porch, waving. Saul was in his store doorway, a hand raised in farewell. Pete watched from the feed store. Beth Carver and her daughter stood near the boarding house. The little girl holding a drawing she'd made. A stick figure man with a hat facing down 3 bigger stick figures. Mara approached, her eyes red like she'd been crying, but her smile genuine. "You're really leaving. Told you I would." "I know. Doesn't make it easier." She handed him a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Something for the road. Don't open it until you're a few miles out." "Mara, you don't need to." "I know I don't need to. Want to. There's a difference." She stepped back, hugging herself against the morning chill. "Thank you for everything, for my business, for my future, for showing me that fear isn't permanent." "You showed yourself that. I just provided the opportunity." She laughed, wiping her eyes. "You're a stubborn man, Elias Crow. Won't even accept gratitude properly." "I accept it. Just don't think I deserve quite as much as people want to give." He mounted his horse, settled into the saddle with the ease of someone who'd spent half his life in one. From this vantage, he could see the whole town, the buildings still marked by yesterday's violence, the people already working to repair what had been damaged, the future taking shape in real time. Sheriff Dawes emerged from his office, young Charlie at his side. Both wore their badges proudly. Dawes touched the brim of his hat in salute, and Elias returned the gesture. Then he turned his horse and started riding. The town followed him to its edge, people lining the street, calling out thanks and farewells. He acknowledged them with nods and waves, but didn't stop. Stopping made leaving harder, and leaving was necessary. At the town's boundary, the spot where Dry Hollow's dusty streets gave way to open prairie, he paused and looked back one final time. The morning sun was higher now, painting the buildings gold, making the place look almost beautiful despite its rough edges. A week ago, this had been a town dying under tyranny's boot. Now it was a town remembering how to breathe. That was enough. He rode west, the morning sun warming his back, his thoughts already turning toward whatever came next. An hour out, he remembered Mara's package and unwrapped it. Inside was a small leather journal and a note in neat handwriting. Someone should write down what you do, so people know it's possible. If you won't do it, maybe this will inspire someone else who needs the reminder that one person can make a difference. He smiled at that, tucked the journal into his saddlebag. Maybe he'd write something, maybe not. But the thought was kind, and kindness counted for something. The road stretched ahead, endless and possibility-laden. Somewhere out there was another town with another problem, another group of people who'd forgotten they had the power to fix what was broken. Another tyrant who needed to learn that empires built on fear always fell. Elias Crow would find them. He always did. Behind him, Dry Hollow continued its transformation. Within a month, the bullet holes would be repaired. Within 6 months, new businesses would open. Within a year, children would be born who'd never know what it was like to live under the Mercers' rule. Mara rebuilt her father's freight business and expanded it, eventually running the largest operation in 3 territories. She never married, claiming she was too busy, but everyone knew she was too particular. No man she met could measure up to the impossible standard set by a stranger who'd spent 2 days in town and changed everything. Sheriff Dawes served for another 15 years before retiring. Charlie succeeded him, and then Sarah Hendricks after that, creating a legacy of honest law enforcement that lasted generations. The town council became a model for democratic governance in frontier communities. The church where the trial had been held became a kind of shrine. Visitors would come from other towns to see where justice had been served, where one man's courage had sparked a town's resurrection. Tours were given. Stories were told. The legend grew as legends do, until the truth and the myth became impossible to separate. But the core remained true. Elias Crow had ridden into Dry Hollow, ordered 3 coffins, and backed up his words with precision and purpose. In less than a week, he dismantled an empire and reminded a broken town that it had never actually been broken. Just bent, just waiting for someone to show it how to straighten again. Brock Mercer was hanged on schedule. He went to the gallows, cursing everyone involved, unrepentant to the last. The town watched in silence, bearing witness not out of bloodlust but out of completion, the final punctuation on a chapter they were ready to close. Silas Mercer spent 23 years in territorial prison before dying of pneumonia. He was reportedly a model prisoner, quiet and compliant, who spent his days in the library reading law books and history. Some said he was trying to understand where he'd gone wrong. Others said he was just trying to stay sane. The truth, like most truths, was probably somewhere in between. Miller and Jackson both survived their wounds and were tried separately. Miller got 10 years for his role as hired muscle. Jackson got 7. Both served their time, got released, and disappeared into territory legend, cautionary tales about the cost of selling your gun to evil men. Morris the Undertaker kept the 2 pine coffins in his shop for years, eventually using them for elderly townspeople who died peacefully in their sleep. A fitting end for boxes that had been ordered for violence but ultimately served peace. The 3rd coffin, the one that went unfilled, became a symbol. Morris displayed it in his window with a small plaque. For the next tyrant who thinks Dry Hollow forgot how to fight. No one ever needed it. And Elias Crow rode on, his gray mare carrying him toward the next horizon, the next town, the next broken thing that needed fixing. He carried Dawes' badge in his pocket and Mars' journal in his saddlebag. He carried the memory of a town that had chosen courage over fear, justice over compromise, tomorrow over today. Most importantly, he carried the knowledge that he'd done what needed doing, the way it needed to be done, and that somewhere behind him, people were living freer because of it. That was his purpose. That was his gift. Not the fastest draw or the best aim, but the absolute certainty that wrong could be made right, that tyrants could be toppled, that ordinary people could do extraordinary things if someone just showed them it was possible. He was the match that lit the fire. They were the ones who kept it burning. And in the vast expanse of frontier territory, where law was often more hope than reality, where violence and greed could rule for years unchecked, that made all the difference. The sun climbed higher. The prairie stretched endless. Elias Crow rode alone into the west, already becoming the story people would tell, the legend that would inspire, the proof that one person standing up could change everything. Somewhere ahead, another town was waiting. Another group of people living under someone's boot, thinking rescue was impossible, not realizing that rescue was riding toward them on a gray mare, wearing a dusty coat, carrying a peacemaker, and an unshakable belief that broken things could be fixed. He'd find them. He always did. And when he did, he'd probably start by sitting at the wrong table, ordering coffee, and saying something quietly certain that made tyrants nervous and victims brave. Because that's what Elias Crow did. Not because he was a hero, he'd be the first to deny that label. Not because he was fearless, he knew fear better than most. But because he was a man who saw what needed fixing and possessed the rare combination of skill, courage, and stubbornness required to fix it. The world needed men like him. Towns like Dry Hollow proved it. And as long as there were broken places that needed mending, Elias Crow would keep riding, keep fixing, keep moving, a permanent wanderer who made temporary homes in the spaces between tyranny and justice, fear and courage, yesterday and tomorrow. The story of Dry Hollow would be told for generations. Children would hear about the stranger who ordered 3 coffins and backed up his words with bullets and bravery. Adults would remember it as the day their town chose to stand up. Historians would document it as a turning point in frontier justice. But Elias Crow wouldn't be there to hear any of it. He'd be somewhere else, doing it again, being the catalyst that transformed fear into action, oppression into freedom, despair into hope. One town at a time, one tyrant at a time, one broken thing at a time. Until there were no more broken things left to fix. And if that day ever came, if the frontier finally civilized itself to the point where men like him weren't needed, well, then maybe he'd finally accept one of those offers to stay. Find a town that wanted him, not for what he could do, but for who he was. Hang up his gun, settle into a life of coffee and quiet mornings and conversations that didn't involve calculating angles of fire. Maybe, but probably not. Because men like Elias Crow weren't built for settling. They were built for moving, for finding, for fixing. And the world, despite its progress and its laws and its best intentions, would always have broken things that needed someone willing to do the hard work of mending them. So he rode. Into the west, into the unknown, into whatever came next. Behind him, Dry Hollow woke to its first full day of freedom in 4 years, and the people there began the slow, beautiful work of building a future worth the price they'd paid to reclaim it. Ahead of him, another town waited in the dust and distance, not knowing yet that help was coming, that change was possible, that one man could make all the difference. And between those 2 points, The town saved and the town waiting rode Elias Crow, neither hero nor villain, neither saint nor sinner, just a man doing what needed doing because someone had to, and he'd decided it might as well be him. 3 coffins, 1 promise, and the absolute certainty that when morning came, the world could be different than it was the night before. That was the lesson of Dry Hollow. That was the legacy of Elias Crow. And that was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth believing in when the world seemed too broken to fix, because it proved what people most needed to know. That broken things could be mended, that tyrants could fall, that ordinary people could find extraordinary courage, and that sometimes all it took was one person willing to stand up and say, "No more." The rest was just details. And Elias Crow had always been very good with details.